The mass reading overflowed the field before Junior Assessor Nayu Castle had finished pouring her morning stimulant, and for 3 full seconds she believed the console was broken. It was not the number that unsettled her. It was the way the number kept climbing. On the registry display, where the inbound accession vessel should have resolved as a clean 4-digit tonnage, the figure spilled past its allotted digits, rolled the field into overflow, and painted the whole panel in the amber of a fault she had never once seen trip in her 9 years at the desk. She set the cup down. She wiped the readout with 2 fingers, the old habit of a clerk who trusted grime over instruments, and the number was still there, still rising, a mass that did not belong to any vessel that had ever been logged at Coriol Way Station. "Asa," she said, her voice came out flatter than she meant it. "Asa, come look at this before I file it." The junior clerk drifted over from the ceremonial side of the hall, where he had spent the last hour arranging the accession sashes by color. Coriol was dressed for a good day. The reception hall glittered with the pale banners of the assessorate, the hanging balances of woven brass, the long table set for 11, where the human delegation would be seated and weighed and welcomed into the concord of registered mass. Somewhere below, the harbor cruise had cleared a single berth, a modest slot 42 meters on its longest axis, because that was the length of the vessel the humans had filed for their arrival. A courier, a small ship, as befitted a small and grateful species stepping across the selvage into the ledger of the civilized. Asa looked at the overflow field, and his throat membrane flexed the way it did when he was about to say something stupid. "That's a sensor ghost. You get them off the boundary. The selvage scatters returns." "It's not scattering. It's resolving." Nayu pulled the raw feed up beside the registry field because she did not trust the pretty display and she did trust the raw. The raw was worse. The raw showed a single coherent contact decelerating out of the dark on the far side of the boundary marker. One object, one hull. Its return so bright and so clean that the array had at first refused to believe a ship could be responsible for it, and had tried to file it as a small moon. "Asa, go get the overwarden." "For a sensor ghost." "For a moon that's slowing down." That moved him, he went. Nayu sat back and made herself breathe. She was young for her post, the youngest full assessor Coriol had ever fielded, and she had learned early that the way to keep the post was to never be the one who panicked first. So she did not panic. She did the work. She keyed the contact for a class assignment because that was the entire function of an assessor, to look at a thing that crossed into registered space and tell the ledger what it was. Every vessel had a class. Every class had a ceiling. The assessorate had governed 40,000 years of peace by the simplest law any species had ever devised. That mass was power. That power was licensed, and that no hull moved through conquered space heavier than the license its owners had earned. A courier species flew couriers. A freight species flew freighters. The great old powers, the founding signatories, flew warships within the ceilings of their charters, and even they, even the proud Vantary with their 2,000 dread licenses, did not build past Class 1, because past Class 1 there was no class. The ledger simply ended. It had never needed to go further. She entered the contact and asked the ledger for its class, and the ledger told her the contact had no class, and for the second time that morning Nayu Castle felt the floor of a known world tilt very slightly under her. The overflow was not an error. The vessel decelerating toward Coriol Way Station was heavier than Class 1. It was heavier than the ceiling of the entire registry. It was, according to the only instrument the assessorate had ever needed, not a vessel at all, because vessels had classes and this thing did not. "File it," she told herself under her breath, the way her first supervisor had drilled her. "When the instrument frightens you, file it. Filing is the cure for fear." She began the incident record. Contact designation provisional. Origin bearing, boundary marker 9, the human approach corridor. Mass, and here she stopped, because there was no field wide enough for the mass. and she had to open the overflow annex and enter it as a range. And the range began at a number larger than the flagship of the Vantary, and had no upper bound she was willing to commit to the record. The reception hall's doors sighed open, and the overwarden came in at the fast, careful walk of a senior officer who has been told there is a problem, and has already decided it is someone else's. Saul Marovic had run Coriol for 30 years. He wore the double balance of a boundary overwarden and the soft heaviness of a man who had never in 3 decades faced anything the ledger could not name. Castle, Asa says you have a moon. I have the accession vessel overwarden. She turned the display so he could see it. The human ship. It's inbound on their filed corridor on their filed schedule, squawking their filed accession transponder. Everything is correct except the ship. What's wrong with the ship? It doesn't have a class. He looked at the overflow annex. She watched him read it the way she had read it, watched the number climb past the last landmark he knew and keep climbing, watched the small muscles around his eyes do the thing that 30 years of authority could not quite stop them from doing. That's a fault, he said. Run the array cold and warm it fresh. I ran the raw agrees. Then it's a formation. Several hulls close aboard, reading as one. One transponder, one return, one deceleration curve. If it's a formation overwarden, it's a formation flying so tight that nothing can be flying it, and it's all slowing down together to berth at a slot built for a courier. She let that sit, because she had learned that the strongest thing an assessor could do in front of a frightened superior was to be calm and specific. The humans filed a 42-meter vessel. The contact is not 42 meters. I make it a little over 3 kilometers on the long axis, and I make the mass, she gestured at the annex, at the range with no ceiling, unregisterable. The word landed in the ceremonial hall like a dropped tray. Unregisterable. It was not an insult and it was not a threat. It was worse than either. It was a category the assessorate did not have, because the assessorate had spent 40,000 years making certain the category never needed to exist. Marovic straightened. The authority came back into him, and Neu was almost grateful for it because someone in the room had to pretend the floor was solid. Signals, hail the contact, standard boundary challenge, then the accession greeting. If it's the humans, they'll answer to protocol, and if it isn't, we'll have it in the record before we escalate. He glanced at her. And get me the Corvette flight up. I want eyes on that hull before it's inside the marker. The Corvette flight. Neu had watched those 3 little cutters sit in their cradles for 9 years and launch for nothing more dangerous than a smuggler's freighter with a doctored license. She keyed the flight order and thought, as she did it, that she would give a year of her stipend to unsend it. Cutter pilot Odd Toma had been asleep in his flight harness, which was against every regulation, and which was the only way anyone on the Corvette flight ever got any sleep, when the launch tone went off and put his heart into his throat. He was 26 standard, 3 years on the boundary, and he had never once launched hot. The Corvette flight existed to be a formality, 3 light cutters that could shame a freighter into heaving to, that could paint a smuggler for the impound tugs, that had exactly enough teeth to make an unarmed civilian reconsider, and not 1 gram more. Coriol was a reception station. Nothing came across the selvage here but trade and treaty. That was the point of the boundary. The dangerous things stayed on the far side, in the unregistered dark, and the ledger kept them there. Flight Coriol control. The voice in his ear was the young assessor's Castle, the one the harbor crews all quietly liked because she remembered their names. She did not sound like herself. You are cleared hot on the human approach corridor. Visual identification of the accession contact, then hold at 10,000 and report. Do not close inside 10,000. Repeat, do not close inside 10,000. Control Toma. 10,000's awful far to eyeball a 40-meter courier. He was already boosting, the cutter's frame shuddering around him. his two wingmen falling into the loose V they'd flown 100 times over nothing. "It's not 40 meters, Castle said. "You'll see it before 10,000. You'll see it before 100,000. He laughed because it seemed like the thing to do. Then his forward return painted the contact, and he stopped laughing because the scale marker on his display had done something he had never seen it do. It had rescaled itself twice while he watched, zooming out, and the object that had been a dot was now a bar across his screen, and the bar had structure, and the structure had structure, and none of it was slowing down enough to be afraid of 3 cutters. "Control," he said, his mouth had gone dry. "Control, I have visual." "Describe it." He tried. He was a pilot, not a poet, and he found he did not have the words for it, so he gave her what a pilot gives the shapes. "It's long. It's control. It's a slab. It's a wall with an edge. There's a prow. I think that's a prow. It's canted forward like a blade. And behind it the hull just goes, it goes, and it goes. I'm reading gun positions. I think those are gun positions. There are dozens. Hundreds. Control, the little lights all along the flank. That's not running lights, that's windows, it's a city, it's a hole. How close are you?" He checked, his stomach dropped. 30,000 and it fills my forward screen. Control, at 10,000 I won't be able to see the ends of it. There was a silence on the channel that he would remember for the rest of his life. Then Castle, very quietly off the formal cadence, said, "Hold at 15. Don't crowd it odd." Neu had never heard the overwarden ask for a chair. He asked for one now, and Asa brought it, and Marovic sat in the middle of the ceremonial hall with the accession banners hanging pale above him, and watched the Corvette flights feed on the main plate. The human ship filled it. It was not a beautiful ship. The Vantari built beautiful ships, all swept lines and mirror hulls, ships that looked like the ceilings of their charters, licensed and proud. This thing looked like a foundry that had learned to move. Its hull was dark and layered and scarred, plated and replated in mismatched alloy, whole sections a different age than the sections beside them, scorched here, patched there, its long flanks streaked with the discoloration of a thing that had been somewhere the assessorate had never sent a form to. There were guns. Neu did not know they were guns the way an assessor knows a thing. She knew it the way an animal knows a predator in the body, before the mind agrees. The turrets sat in ranked batteries down the spine and along the flanks, barrels she could have flown her cutter down, and they were not aimed at anything, and that was the worst part. A weapon aimed at you is a threat. A weapon not aimed at you, on a hull that large, is a statement about how little you matter. "Its class," Marovic said to no one. "What is its class?" "It doesn't have one," Neu said, for the 3rd time, and this time it did not sound like a fault. This time it sounded like a fact about the universe that she was only now, at 29 standard, being allowed to learn. "Overwarden, the humans have been a probationary species for 60 years. Class 7, courier license. In 60 years they have shown us 31 vessels and not one of them massed more than a boundary freighter. We assessed them. We put them in the ledger. We built a berth for their courier and set a table for 11. I know what we did, Castle. Then we assessed a species that owns that." She did not raise her voice. She had learned that too, and it was here the whole time. The hail channel chimed. Signals had been reaching out for 4 minutes into a silence that had begun to feel like the silence of a thing deciding whether to answer. And now the answer came, and it came in clean trade standard, unhurried. A human voice pitched low and even and entirely without threat, which somehow made every membrane in the hall go tight. "Coriol Way Station, this is the vessel on your accession corridor. I have your challenge and your greeting. Thank you for both. This is Adamant of Earth's 9th line. We're here for the accession. We're a little early and we apologize for the confusion about the berth. We won't be needing it. We'll hold at the marker and send our delegation across in something more appropriate to your harbor. Please advise your reception when you're ready to receive 11. Marovic found his voice. Nayu gave him credit for it. Adamant, Coriol control. Your filed vessel is a Class 7 courier, 42 meters. You are not a Class 7 courier. No, the human voice agreed pleasantly. We're not. Then you are in violation of your accession license and of the registered mass on entry into conquered space. You are adamant. I have no class to assign you. You exceed the ceiling of the ledger. A pause. When the human answered, there was something in the voice that Nayu would spend a long time trying to name, and the closest she would ever come was this. It was the patience of someone who has had this conversation before, on other boundaries, with other clerks, and knows exactly how it ends. We understand that's a difficulty for you, the human said. It's not a difficulty for us. We'll wait while you sort out the paperwork. Take your time. We've got plenty of it. The channel closed, and in the quiet of the reception hall, under the banners set for a small and grateful species, Junior Assessor Nayu Castle looked at the 3-kilometer scar of a ship holding at the edge of everything the ledger could name, and understood, with the cold total clarity of a young mind meeting the true size of the world for the first time, that the assessorate had made a filing error, and that the filing error had guns. The escalation went up the way escalations always went up in the assessorate, not as alarm, but as paperwork moving faster than usual. Marovic did not declare an emergency, because Coriol had no procedure for a vessel that exceeded the ledger, and a good overwarden does not invent procedure in front of his staff. Instead, he did the correct thing, the ledger thing, the thing 40,000 years of law told him to do with a vessel in violation of registered mass. He filed an impound notice, and he forwarded it to the tithe fleet, the enforcement arm of the assessorate, the armored hand that made the ledger mean something. In 40,000 years, the tithe fleet had impounded overweight freighters, unlicensed cruisers, the occasional ambitious warlord who had built one class above his charter and learned why that was unwise. It was very good at what it did. It had never failed. Its martial assessor, a Vantary named Dole, commanded 4,000 hulls across the inner boundary, every one of them within charter, every one of them licensed, every one of them a lawful expression of exactly as much power as its owners had earned. Nayu watched the impound notice leave Coriol's relay and thought, watching it go, that they were about to serve a parking citation on a moving mountain. She did not say so. She filed her incident record instead, complete and clean, because that was the work, and because she had begun to understand that the record might outlive the station. She timestamped the human's transmission. She logged the Corvette flight's feed. She entered, in the assessor's own field, the field reserved for a professional's judgment, the sentence that would later be read aloud in a chamber she would never be important enough to enter. The vessel's mass is not the danger. The danger is that its owners flew it here as a courtesy. Asa read it over her shoulder and did not understand it. They're one ship, he said. The tithe fleet is 4,000. Whatever it is, it's one ship. Yes, Nayu said. She was watching the plate where Adamant sat at the marker, unhurried, its 100 windows glowing warm along a hull that had been through something none of them could name. That's what frightens me. They know it's one ship, and they came anyway, and they apologized about the berth. The delegation came across in a shuttle after all, and the shuttle was the first thing that made Overwarden Marovic afraid in a way he could name. It was 40 meters. It was the filed courier, the small, correct Class 7 vessel the humans had promised, released from a launch bay in Adamant's flank like a seed dropped from a fist. It crossed the marker on the proper vector, squawked the proper transponder, and settled into the modest berth the harbor crews had cleared as if the entire morning had gone according to plan. 11 humans disembarked in soft ceremonial dress, unarmed, carrying the accession gifts the protocol required, a folded cloth, a sealed jar of soil, a book. They were polite. They were smaller than the assessorate had expected, and they moved carefully in the station's gravity. And their leader, A broad, gray-templed human who gave her name as Commodore Hale, bowed exactly as deep as the protocol asked, and not 1 degree deeper. That was what frightened Marovic, not the warship at the marker, the bow. Because the warship at the marker was a thing that had happened to him, an accident of scale, a filing error with guns, and a man could tell himself an accident was an accident. But the bow was a choice. The humans had brought a 3-kilometer weapon to a courier's welcome, and then they had folded it away and sent across the exact small ship they had promised, and bowed to his balances and offered him soil in a jar, and every gesture said the same thing under its courtesy. We can be as small as you need us to be. We are choosing to be small right now. Notice that it is a choice. He received them in the ceremonial hall because there was nowhere else to put them, and the great plate above the long table still showed adamant at the marker, and no one turned it off, and everyone pretended not to look at it. Commodore Hale, Marovic said, when the gifts had been laid on the balances and weighed and recorded, because even now the ledger had to be served. Welcome to Coriol. Welcome to the conquered. I must, before we proceed, address the vessel that brought you. Of course. Hale folded her hands. Neu, standing at the assessor's post at the side of the hall because someone had to keep the record and she had refused to let Asa do it, watched the human's face and found she could read almost nothing in it, and what little she could read was patience. Adamant. Ask what you like, Overwarden. We've got nothing to hide about her. She's on your accession corridor squawking her true transponder. We didn't sneak her in. You filed a courier. We filed the vessel that would carry our delegation across your harbor per your protocol. That's her. Hale nodded at the little shuttle's berth, visible through the hall's long window. Adamant isn't crossing your harbor. She's holding at your marker in open space, on the far side of your boundary from your station. She's not in your harbor, Overwarden. We read your law carefully. We're not in violation of anything you've actually written down. Marovic had spent 30 years in the ledger, and he knew a true reading of the law when he heard one, and he hated that he knew it. The registered mass applies to all hulls in conquered space. She's inside the boundary marker. She's at the marker, station keeping, not maneuvering under power into your registered volume. Hale said it without heat, the way a person recites a thing they have already thought through completely. But I'll save us both the afternoon, Overwarden, because I don't think the exact meters are the conversation you want to have. You want to know why we brought her, you want to know what she is, and you want to know what she's for. The hall had gone very quiet, even the human delegation had stilled. Marovic, to his credit, did not look away. Yes. She's a line battleship, Hale said. Earth's 9th line. She's not our biggest, she's not our newest. She was laid down before I was born, and she'll be running after I'm dust because we don't scrap the good ones, we just keep them fed. She let that sit. We brought her because 60 years ago your assessor rate met 11 of our couriers and wrote down what we were. Class 7, a minor species. Grateful, you said. In the file, we've read the file, Overwarden. You gave us a copy at the probation hearing. Grateful and minor. And we let that stand for 60 years. Because we had things to do out past your selvage that were more important than your opinion of us. And now we're crossing your boundary for good, and we've decided you should meet us before you finish deciding what we are. Hale smiled, and it did not reach the rest of her face. You built a berth for a courier, Overwarden. That was a fair guess, based on what we showed you. I don't hold it against you, but I'd take it as a kindness if you tell your tithe fleet before it arrives that the impound notice you filed this morning is a mistake, and that we'd all of us rather it stayed a piece of paper. Neu's stylus stopped moving on the record. She had not told the delegation about the impound notice. Marovic had not told them. It had gone out on an internal enforcement relay, encrypted, stationed to tithe fleet 16 minutes ago. Marovic's voice, when it came, was carefully level. How do you know about the impound notice? Hale's smile widened by nothing at all. We read carefully, she said again. That's the whole trick, Overwarden. We've been reading you for 60 years. Marshal Assessor Dole received the impound notice aboard the Tithe Fleet flagship Immaculate Weight, and did not, at first, think it was interesting. He was old for a Vantary, which meant he was very old indeed, and he had commanded the enforcement of the registered mass across the inner boundary for longer than most species in the Conquered had been signatories. He had impounded 4,000 hulls in his career and lost 9 ships doing it, all 9 to accident, none to resistance, because resistance to the Tithe Fleet was not a thing that happened. It was not that no one had ever tried. It was that the ones who tried had built, at most, 1 class above their charter, and 1 class above charter was a rounding error to a fleet of 4,000 hulls flying at the ceilings of the founding powers. The ledger was not enforced by cruelty. It was enforced by arithmetic, and Dole had never met arithmetic he could not win. The notice said, "Unregisterable vessel exceeds ledger ceiling, single hull holding at Coriol boundary marker, refuses class assignment." He read it the way a man reads a report of a large fish, a curiosity. A big freight species, perhaps, some unlicensed powers past the selvage who had bolted a mining hull together and were trying to bully a reception station. It would mass a great deal, and it would be slow, and it would come apart under a converging fire like every overweight thing always did, because mass was not power. Mass was a target. Power was 4,000 hulls that could each be in a different place at once. "Course for Coriol," he told his flag rating, a young Vantary named Vesh who had drawn the worst watch of her career and did not yet know it. "Enforcement standing, full formation. We'll impound the fish and be back before the accession dinner." "Full formation for 1 hull, Marshal?" Vesh asked, and then wished she hadn't. "For the record, rating." Dole did not look up from the notice. "When we teach a lesson, we teach it in front of everyone. Coriol's an accession station. There'll be new signatories watching. Let them watch us take a mountain apart in an afternoon. It's good for the ledger when the small ones see what happens to the ones who forget their class." Vesh laid in the course. 4,000 hulls came about across the inner boundary and began to gather, and the gathering itself was a thing to see. The licensed might of the founding powers, cruisers of the Vantary and the Olteni and the Sesh, monitors and impound tugs, and the long lean interdiction hulls that could hold a volume of space shut like a fist. It was, Vesh thought, watching her own fleet assemble on the plate, the most powerful thing that had ever existed. It had been the most powerful thing that had ever existed for 40,000 years. That was not pride. It was just the arithmetic. Nothing heavier than Class 1 had ever been built, and the Tithe Fleet was 4,000 hulls of Class 1 and below, and 4,000 of anything beats 1 of anything, and mass is a target, and the ledger always closes. She believed all of that. She had been taught all of that. She would remember, later, in the 19 minutes she spent as one of the last living witnesses, that every single thing she had been taught had been true right up until the moment it wasn't. Odd Toma held his cutter at 15,000 and watched the human battleship do nothing, and the nothing was the most frightening thing he had ever seen. He had expected, once the fear settled, that a warship that size would be busy. Ships were busy. Even a cutter was a constant low chorus of adjustments, thrust and trim, and the endless small corrections of keeping a hull where you wanted it. He had imagined the human giant would be a storm of that, a 3-kilometer engine of motion. Instead, adamant simply held. It sat at the marker with the absolute stillness of something anchored to the floor of the universe, and only the slow, warm pulse of its window lights and the banked coal glow of its engine ports told him it was alive at all. It was not station-keeping. Station-keeping was work. This was rest. The ship was resting, the way a mountain rests, the way a thing rests when nothing in its environment is capable of moving it. "Flight Toma." He kept his voice down, though the human ship could not have heard him and would not have cared. "I've been on it 2 hours. It hasn't fired attitude thrusters once. It's just sitting." "Toma Control," Castle again. She had not left the assessor's post. "The Tithe Fleet's forming up on the inner boundary, 4,000 hulls, Marshal Dole commanding. They'll be here in 6 hours. 4,000. He looked at the mountain. He tried to imagine 4,000 hulls taking it apart, and he found, to his surprise, that he could not. It was not that he thought 4,000 hulls was too few. It was that he could not make himself believe the mountain would let them. Control. Can I ask you something, and you don't have to answer official? Ask. You've read their file, the human file, 60 years of it. He watched a battery of turrets the size of his home district track slowly, unhurried, across the empty dark, not toward him, not toward anything, just exercising, just breathing. What were they doing out past the selvage? For 60 years, while we were writing grateful and minor in their file. The channel was quiet for a moment. When Castle answered, she was not reading from the file. She was telling him a thing she had worked out sitting at her post, watching a warship rest. There's a gap in it, she said, in their history, about 400 years back. They stopped showing us couriers for a while, stopped crossing the selvage at all for 11 years. When they came back, the couriers had new hull markings, new alloys. The pilots flew different. We noted it and filed it as a cultural shift, because a cultural shift is a thing the ledger has a field for. She paused. I pulled the alloy analysis this morning. The new hulls 400 years ago are the same alloy as that. A silence, and Odd understood she meant the mountain. Whatever happened to them out past our boundary 400 years ago, for 11 years, they came out of it building hulls like adamant. And then they went back to showing us couriers, grateful and minor, for 400 years. Odd sat with that. 15,000 meters away, the battleship rested, patient, ancient. Its scars a language no one at Coriol could read. They weren't hiding it because they were afraid of us, he said slowly. They were hiding it because we weren't worth showing. No, Castle said, I don't think we were. The tithe fleet arrived at Coriol 6 hours later, and Marshal Assessor Dole looked at the human battleship on his flag plate for the first time, and something very old and very sure in him began, for the first time in his long life, to feel small. He did not permit it to show. He had 4,000 hulls behind him, and a young flag rating watching him for how to feel, and a fleet takes its nerve from its commander the way a body takes its temperature from its blood. So he studied the contact with the flat professional attention he had given 4,000 pounds, and he catalogued it the way the ledger had taught him: mass, dimensions, armament, and the number that mattered most, the ratio. 1 hull against 4,000. Whatever it massed, it could only be in one place. It had at most some hundreds of gun positions. He had counted, and the count was large, but it was finite, and 4,000 hulls presented more barrels than any single hull could ever answer, because that was the arithmetic, that was the whole and eternal arithmetic of the ledger. Concentration beats mass, distribution beats concentration, and 4,000 distributed hulls beats 1 concentrated mountain every time it has ever been tried. Signal the contact, he told Vesh. Standard enforcement hail. It has 1 chance to strike its drives and submit to impound. Read it its violation. Read it the ceiling it exceeds. And rating. He let the old confidence back into his voice because his fleet needed to hear it. Log the time. I want the record to show how long the mountain lasted. Vesh sent the hail. The human answered at once, the same low, even voice Coriol had logged, unhurried, almost warm. Tithe Fleet, this is Adamant, Earth's 9th line. I have your hail and your violation notice. I'm going to decline the impound, and I want to be very clear about why, because I don't want anyone confused about what's happening here, and I especially don't want your young ones confused. A pause. You've read us as 1 hull, that's correct. 1 hull exceeding your ledger's ceiling, holding at your marker. By your arithmetic, 4,000 of you takes one of me apart in an afternoon, because mass is a target and numbers are power. I know your arithmetic, Marshal. We studied it for 60 years. It's good arithmetic. It's kept your conquered at peace for 40,000 years, and I respect it. Then submit to it, Dole said. I can't do that, the human said gently. Because your arithmetic has an assumption in it, Marshall, and the assumption is that we build ships the way you do, to a ceiling, to a class, to the most power a charter will allow. And we don't. We never have. Out past your selvage, where you never sent a form, we fought things that didn't care about ceilings. And we learned to build to a different question. Not how much power will the law allow. How much does it take to make sure the thing in front of us never does that again? The voice did not change. That was the terrible thing Vesh would remember. The voice never once changed. Adamant isn't our biggest, Marshall. She's a line battleship. There's a line, but she's what we brought to your accession because you wrote minor in our file, and we thought the kindest thing we could do was show you once gently what minor actually looks like. Strike your drives, please. I would very much rather you struck your drives. Dole looked at the mountain on his plate, one hull against his 4,000. And he made the decision that 40,000 years of unbroken arithmetic told him to make. The only decision a marshal of the Tithe fleet had ever made. The decision that had never once been wrong. All hulls, he said. Converging fire, take it apart. 4,000 hulls fired on the same instant, and for 11 seconds Vesh believed the arithmetic. It was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing she had ever seen. And she was ashamed later of how beautiful she had found it. The converging fire of the Tithe fleet was a disciplined 40,000 years in the refining, 4,000 weapon solutions folded into a single blooming lattice of light. Every beam and every mass driver round timed to arrive within the same fraction of a second on the same volume of space, so that the target did not face 4,000 weapons, but one weapon 4,000 times as large. She had drilled it 100 times against empty rock. She had never seen it thrown at a hull. The lattice reached across the dark and closed on the human mountain and struck it all at once, and the flare of it whited out the plate, and Vesh's throat membrane opened in something that was almost a cheer, because that much fire had never once failed to end what it touched. The flare faded. The mountain was still there. It was not that the fire had missed. The fire had not missed. 4,000 hulls of the Tithe fleet did not miss a target 3 kilometers long holding still at a marker. It was that the fire had arrived and struck, and done. Vesh read the damage assessment coming up on her board and read it again, and felt the 11 seconds of belief drain out of her all at once. Done almost nothing. Scoring. Ablation across the forward plating. A few of the outer weathering layers scorched away to show brighter alloy beneath, the way a fingernail scrapes wax off an old table. The battleship's hull had swallowed the concentrated fire of the most powerful fleet in the history of the conquered, and it had come away looking, Vesh thought, with a horror that started small and grew for the rest of her short career, looking cleaner. They had scrubbed 400 years of grime off one section of its flank and shown the metal underneath, and the metal underneath was not even marked. Assessment, Dole said. His voice was still level. She gave him that. His voice was still level. Marshall, Vesh's own voice was not. Marshall, the target is the converging solution landed clean, full lattice, all 4,000 hulls. Damage is cosmetic. Outer ablative layers only. There's no penetration. There's no Marshall. The hull didn't even, she stopped. Because the next word was flex, and the target had not flexed, had not rung, had not shuddered, had not moved so much as a meter off its station under a blow that should have staggered a moon, and she did not know how to put that in a report. Again, Dole said, full lattice, and launch the interdiction hulls. I want it held. If it wants to run, it doesn't run. Vesh almost laughed. If it wants to run. The mountain had never once suggested it wanted to run. It had sat through the single heaviest blow 4,000 hulls could throw, and it had not so much as turned to look at them. Then Adamant answered, and Vesh learned what minor looked like. Odd Toma saw it from 15,000 meters, and he was the closest living witness who would survive to describe it, and he never fully could. The human battleship's spine batteries came alive all at once. He had watched those turrets exercise for 6 hours, tracking slow across empty dark, and he had told himself they were guns the way you tell yourself a sleeping predator is a predator, an intellectual fact, held at a safe distance. Now they woke and the distance stopped being safe, and the intellectual fact became the loudest thing in the universe. There was no drama to it. That was what undid him. The turrets did not swing wildly or flare with charging light or announce themselves. They simply came to bear, the whole spine of the ship rotating its batteries onto the tithe fleet with the unhurried certainty of a foundry aligning a die. And then they fired. And where they fired, the tithe fleet stopped being there. He did not see beams. Whatever adamant threw, it moved too fast for his eyes or his instruments to render as anything but result. One instant there was a squadron of Vantary cruisers, 40 hulls in a proud licensed wall, the pride of a founding power, every one of them within charter. The next instant there was an expanding cloud where the squadron had been, and the cloud was not wreckage the way wreckage is when a ship dies. It was finer than that. It was the ship reduced below the scale at which a ship has parts, and it was already cooling, already dimming, already indistinguishable from the dark. 40 hulls. Odd counted, because counting was the only thing his mind could still do. 40 hulls and then a beat, the turrets tracking 2 degrees, unhurried, and then another 40 and another cloud and another 2 degrees. Control, he whispered. He did not know if the channel was open. Control, it's they're not fighting. The humans aren't fighting. They're control. Do you sweep a floor? It's sweeping. It's just. I see it. Odd. Castle's voice from the station, from the assessor's post where she had refused to stop keeping the record. She was crying, he thought, and still recording, and he loved her a little for it, the way you love anyone who keeps doing the work while the world ends. I see it. I'm logging it. Come home, Odd. Please come home now. I can't move. It was true. His hands were on the controls and his hands would not move because some animal part of him had understood that in the presence of the thing that was crossing the dark 2 degrees at a time, the only safety left in the universe was stillness, was smallness, was being a 40-meter nothing that the mountain had no reason to notice. Control, how many? How many have they? Don't, Castle said. How many? A pause while the assessor did the thing assessors do, the thing she could not stop herself from doing even now, even here. 400, she said. In the first minute, 400 hulls. Odd, they've killed 400 ships of the tithe fleet in 60 seconds and they haven't moved off the marker. They're still station keeping. They're doing it from a dead stop. Marshal Assessor Dole watched his fleet die in blocks of 40 and understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a proud old mind at the exact moment its world ends, that he had spent his entire life defending an arithmetic that had a hole in it, and that the humans had found the hole 400 years ago, out past the selvage, in a war he had never heard of, against an enemy that had never filed a form. The arithmetic said, mass is a target, numbers are power, 4,000 distributed hulls beats 1 concentrated mountain. And the arithmetic was true. It was still true. That was the horror Dole could not escape as he watched immaculate weights plate empty of friendly contacts 2 degrees at a time. The arithmetic had not been wrong. It had been incomplete, because the arithmetic assumed a ceiling. It assumed that the 1 concentrated mountain was a mountain of the same stuff. His 4,000 hulls were made of, built to a class, to a charter, to the most power a law would allow, and that therefore its 1 concentrated blow, however large, was survivable by distribution, and that his 4,000 distributed blows converged would overwhelm its finite armor. Every term in the equation assumed the human ship obeyed the same ceiling his did. It did not obey the ceiling. It had no ceiling. It had never had a ceiling, and an equation with no ceiling in it does not have a solution, it has a victim. Marshal, Vesh's voice. She was very young and she was holding herself together with both hands, and Dole found, in the ruin of everything he had believed, that he had room left in him to be proud of her. Marshal, the interdiction hulls are launched. They're forming the containment volume. They'll have it held in. Recall them, Dole said. Marshal. Recall the interdiction hulls. Recall all forward elements. Cease converging fire. He watched another block of 40 of his ships become a cooling cloud, unhurried 2 degrees, and he made himself say the thing no marshal of the Tithe fleet had ever said in 40,000 years, and he made himself say it in a level voice, because his young ones were watching and a fleet takes its temperature from its blood. We are not going to win this rating. I want that understood on every hull that can still hear me. We are not going to win this. There is no formation and no solution and no number of us that wins this. I have commanded this fleet for longer than your grandmother lived, and I am telling you the truth for the last time I will get to tell it. The ledger was wrong, not the arithmetic, the ledger. There was a page missing, and the humans are the page, and they came here today to let us read it gently, and I fired on them instead. He drew a breath. Signal the human ship. Tell them the Tithe fleet strikes its drives. Tell them I am striking my drives. Tell them, and here, for the first time, the level voice cracked one hairline and then held. Tell them the martial assessor of the conquered asks them to stop, and that he understands he has no standing to ask. The turret stopped. Neu Castle, at the assessor's post at Coriol, watched the human battleship's spine batteries cease fire between one 2-degree tracking step and the next, mid-sweep, the way a hand stops writing when someone finally answers the question it was asking. The killing stopped so cleanly, so completely, so instantly on the marshal's signal that it took her a moment to understand what the cleanness meant, and when she understood it, she had to put her stylus down, because her hand was not steady enough to hold it. The humans had heard the surrender inside a fraction of a second, and stopped inside a fraction of a second, which meant they had been able to stop the entire time. Which meant every ship that had died in the last 2 minutes and 40 seconds had died in the interval between a surrender that could have come and a surrender that did. And the length of that interval had been set entirely by the marshal's pride, and the humans had simply been waiting, patiently, spine batteries sweeping 2 degrees at a time, for the pride to run out. They had not been fighting a battle. They had been holding a door open, unhurried, and letting the Tithe fleet decide how many of its own ships to throw through it before someone thought to close it. The Hale channel chimed. Commodore Hale's voice, still low, still even, still without any triumph in it at all, which was the thing Neu would never forget. The thing she would try to make her own children understand 100 years later when the story had become a thing the conquered told at accession dinners. There had been no triumph in it. A species that had just unmade the most powerful fleet in 40,000 years of history, from a dead stop, in under 3 minutes, and there had been nothing in its voice but a kind of tired regret, the regret of someone who has had to prove a point they would much rather have left unproven. Tithe fleet, this is adamant. We accept your strike. Ceasing fire, you'll have seen we already have. Hold your remaining hulls where they are and we'll hold ours. A pause. Marshal, I heard what you told your young ones about the missing page. I want you to know that was well said and truer than you know, and I'm sorry you had to learn it the way you did. For what it's worth, we didn't want this either. We really did file a courier. The surrender should have ended it. In a just accounting of the day, it would have ended it. But the assessorate was not, in the end, its fleets or its wardens or its assessors. It was a chamber, very far from Coriol, on the old signatory world of Vantes Prime, where the High Ledger sat. And the High Ledger had never in 40,000 years received a report that a marshal of the Tithe fleet had struck his drives to a single hull, and it did not have a field for that either. Archivist Second Lorsch Vale was 24 Standard, the newest clerk in the hall of the High Ledger, and she was the one who logged the Coriol dispatch when it came in, because logging the frontier traffic was the lowest task in the hall, and it fell, as low tasks do, to the newest. She read Dole's report 3 times. She read the casualty count, 940 hulls of the Tithe fleet, unmade in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, from a target that had never left its marker, and she felt the number the way Neu Castle had felt the overflow field, not as information, but as a tilting of the floor. Then she did the thing she had been trained to do, the thing the hall existed to do, the only thing 40,000 years of institutional certainty knew how to do with a fact it could not bear. She took it to the prime assessor, and the prime assessor refused it. Lorsch was in the chamber when it happened, standing at the archivist's rail where the newest clerk stands to hand up documents and be ignored, and she watched the oldest and most powerful people in the Concord receive the news that their arithmetic had a hole in it, and reject the news, because the news was more frightening than any lie they could tell instead. The prime assessor was a vantary of enormous age named Thel Osk, and he had governed the ledger for 200 years, and he said, in the dry, certain voice of a being who had never once in 2 centuries been contradicted by reality, Marshal Dole is relieved. His report is the report of a broken commander who lost his nerve and surrendered a founding fleet to a single overweight hull. We will not amend the ledger on the word of a coward. 1 ship does not defeat 4,000. It is arithmetically impossible. The marshal panicked, mistook a heavy raider for something it is not, and disgraced his charter. The ledger stands. Lorsch at the rail thought of the casualty count and of the phrase in Dole's report. The phrase "a broken coward does not write," there was a page missing, and the humans are the page. She thought about saying it aloud. She was 24 and she was the newest clerk in the hall, and she did not say it aloud, and she would carry that silence for the rest of her life, though in fairness to her it would not have mattered. The prime assessor was not looking for information. He was looking for a way to keep the floor solid, and 40,000 years of unbroken authority is a very deep floor, and a species does not walk off it because one frontier station sends a frightening number. The ledger stands, the prime assessor said again, and the hall took its temperature from him, the way a body takes its temperature from its blood. Convene the convocation, not the tithe fleet. The tithe fleet has shown it can be broken by a raider's trick. Convene all of it, every charter, every founding power, every hull the conquered can license. We will go to Coriol, and we will impound this vessel with such overwhelming force that the arithmetic reasserts itself in front of every watching species, and the missing page, his old voice did not so much as flicker, will be revealed for what it is, a rumor, a frightened man's excuse. We have been the most powerful thing in this galaxy for 40,000 years. We did not become that by amending our law every time a large ship frightened a clerk. Lorsch Vale logged the order. It was the largest order ever entered into the high ledger. The convocation had been convened 4 times in 40,000 years, and never at full strength, and never against one hull. She entered the mobilization and watched the numbers assemble on the hall's great tally board as the charters answered. The founding powers and their client species and their client species clients, every hull the ledger could name, and the tally climbed and climbed the way the mass reading had climbed at Coriol, except that this time it was the Concord itself that was overflowing its fields. When the tally settled, 3 days later, it read 611,000 hulls. Lorsch looked at the number for a long time. Then she pulled the human file. She had the archivist's access, and no one was watching the newest clerk, and she read the 60 years of it, the 31 couriers, the 11-year gap 400 years back, the alloy analysis some assessor at Coriol named Castle had flagged that very morning and forwarded to the hall where it had been filed and ignored. And Lorsch Vale, 24 Standard, understood something the prime assessor with his 200 years could not let himself understand, that a species which could build adamant, and which had built adamant 400 years ago, and which had then spent 400 years politely showing the conquered couriers, that such a species had not been hiding out of fear. It had been hiding out of courtesy. And that the convocation was not about to impound a raider. It was about to find out, in front of 611,000 hulls, exactly how much courtesy the humans had been extending, and exactly what the withdrawal of that courtesy looked like. She did not log that thought, but she saved the file to a private cache, because some animal part of her had understood that when this was over, the record would matter more than anything, and that the newest clerk in the hall might be the only one still keeping it. At Coriol, the accession dinner was served. This was Commodore Hale's doing, and Overwarden Marovic would think about it for the rest of his life, because it was the single most frightening thing the humans did, more frightening than the battleship, more frightening than the 2 minutes and 40 seconds. 3 days after Adamant unmade 940 hulls of the Tithe fleet, with 600,000 more converging on the boundary, the human delegation came back across in their 40-meter courier, in soft ceremonial dress, unarmed, carrying a folded cloth and a jar of soil and a book, and they asked, with grave courtesy, whether the accession might proceed as scheduled, because they had come a long way and they did not wish to be rude. Marovic received them because he did not know what else to do. He sat the 11 of them at the long table set for 11, under the pale banners, and the great plate above showed the boundary where the convocation was gathering like a second sky, and the humans ate the reception meal and complimented the preparation, and behaved, in every particular, like a small and grateful species being welcomed into the ledger of the civilized. Neu Castle kept the record, because someone had to, and because she could not have left the room if the station had ordered her to. And midway through the meal, Commodore Hale set down her utensils and spoke, not loudly to Marovic, but the whole table heard it, and so did the record. "Your High Ledger has convened the convocation," Hale said. "It was not a question. 611,000 hulls. They'll be at your boundary in 9 days. Marovic did not ask how she knew. He had stopped asking how the humans knew things. "Yes. I'd like to ask you something, Overwarden, and I'd like you to understand I'm asking it as a courtesy because you've been decent to us, and this is a decent world you keep out here on the edge." Hale folded her hands. "When the convocation arrives, they're going to order us to submit to impound, the same as the Tithe fleet did, and we're going to decline, the same as we declined. And then 611,000 hulls are going to do to us what 4,000 tried to do. And it's going to go the way it went. You've seen how it goes." She let that sit, and there was no threat in it, only the terrible, tired regret. "I can't stop that, I've tried. We've been trying for 60 years, Overwarden, that's what the couriers were. 60 years of showing you the smallest, gentlest, most grateful face we had, hoping that when the day came that we crossed your boundary for good, you'd have learned enough of us to take the crossing quietly. We were wrong, that's on us. We misjudged how deep your floor was." She looked at him, and Neu, watching, thought she had never seen a face carry so much and show so little. "So I'm asking you the only thing I can ask. When the convocation comes and it goes the way it goes, keep your station out of it. Keep your young ones out of it. Don't add Coriol's hulls to the count, because the humans are going to survive the 9th day, Overwarden. We always survive. That was never in question. The only thing in question is the number, and I would like the number to be as small as I can make it, and the only power I have to make it small is to ask decent people to stand aside." The hall was silent. Marovic looked at the 11 small, unarmed humans at his table, and at the second sky gathering on the plate above them, and he asked the question that Neu would enter into the record in letters she pressed so hard the stylus nearly broke. "What are you?" the Overwarden said. "What are you that you can say that and mean it, and pass the soul jar with the same hand?" And Commodore Hale, of Earth's 9th line, considered the question with real care, the way you answer a child who has asked something that deserves a true answer. And then she said the thing that went into the record, and out of the record into the conquered, and out of the conquered into 40,000 years of history that would have to be renumbered from that day. "We're the page your ledger was missing," she said. "Every ledger has one. You just went longer than most before you found yours." Gun Captain Orduvane commanded the forward battery of the Vanterie cruiser Recompense, and on the 8th day of the gathering he stood in his turret and watched the convocation assemble around him and felt, for the last unclouded time in his life, the pure clean certainty of belonging to the most powerful thing that had ever existed. He was young, 30 standard, newly posted to a founding power hull, the pride of a family that had crewed the Tithe for 9 generations, and he had heard the rumors out of Coriol the way everyone in the fleet had heard them, and he had done what a proud young officer does with a rumor that frightens him. He had decided it was a lie. Marshal Dole had lost his nerve. A raider had bloodied a scattered patrol, and the old fool had panicked and struck his drives, and now the whole convocation had been dragged out to the frontier to clean up a coward's mess. That was the story Ordu told himself, and it was the story the fleet told itself, because it was the only story that let a hull captain sleep. 940 ships did not die to one hull. It was arithmetically impossible. The Prime Assessor had said so, and the Prime Assessor had governed the ledger for 200 years, and the floor was very deep. And the convocation was a thing that made the story easy to believe. Ordu had never seen its like. No one had. It had not been assembled at full strength in 40,000 years. From Recompense's forward battery he could see, on the tactical repeater, the shape of it, 611,000 hulls arrayed across the approaches to the Coriol boundary in the great nested spheres of a full convocation order. The founding powers at the core, their clients in the middle shells, the client screening the outer envelope, a formation so vast that its far edge was 6 light towers from its near edge, and a signal took a quarter of a day to cross it. It was not a fleet. It was a migration of war. It was every gram of licensed power the conquered had accumulated in 40 millennia, gathered into one place, pointed at one hull, and Ordu Vane looked at it and thought, with the whole certainty of his young heart, nothing survives this. Whatever the humans are, whatever they built, nothing in this galaxy survives 600,000 hulls. The arithmetic is the arithmetic. He said as much, in the wardroom on the 8th night, to the strange, quiet Vantari who had come aboard Recompense with the Coriol survivors, a rating named Vesh, who had been on immaculate weight when the Marshal struck his drives, and who did not talk much, and who had a way of looking at the tactical repeater as if it were a headstone. "You were there," Ordu said, not unkindly because he pitied her. Everyone pitied the Coriol survivors, the poor broken things who had watched their Marshal lose his nerve. "Tell me true, raiding, off the record. It was a raider, wasn't it? A heavy raider that caught a scattered patrol." The Marshal panicked. Vesh looked at him for a long moment. She was younger than he was, he realized, when he looked closely, younger than he was, and her eyes were older than his grandfather's. "How many hulls do we have in the convocation, gun captain?" 611,000. He said it with pride. He could not help the pride. On immaculate weight before it started, the Marshal said something to me. He said, "When we teach a lesson, we teach it in front of everyone." Vesh's voice was flat and even and terrible. "We had 4,000 hulls, and we were going to teach the mountain a lesson in front of the watching species. It taught us instead. It killed 940 of us in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, from a dead stop, without leaving its marker, and then it stopped the instant the Marshal struck his drives, because it had been able to stop the whole time, and it was only ever waiting for us to be finished. It never fought us, gun captain. You cannot fight a thing that is not fighting you. It cleaned us off the dark like grime off a table, and it was sorry about it. And now," she looked back at the repeater, at the vast nested spheres, 611,000 hulls, the migration of war. "Now we've brought 600,000 hulls so that it can be sorry about a bigger number. That's all the convocation is, gun captain. That's all we are. We're the size of the number it's going to be sorry about." Ordu Vane laughed, because he was young and proud and the floor was very deep, and he told her she had been broken by the frontier, and he went to his turret on the 9th morning with the whole clean certainty of his heart intact. He would remember her face, in the 14 minutes he had left, more clearly than he remembered his own. On the 7th night of the gathering, a client hull fired on Adamant, and Adamant did nothing, and the nothing was recorded, and the record of the nothing would later damn the Prime Assessor more completely than any of the guns. The hull was a light cruiser of the Sethric, a client power whose young captain had drunk too deep of the Prime Assessor's certainty, and too little of the Coriol survivors' warnings, and who decided, in the long, tense dark of the seventh night, that the fleet's caution was cowardice, and that a bold hull could open the account and win the season's glory. He brought his cruiser out ahead of the formation, against orders, and he fired a full solution into the mountain at close range. A real solution, well aimed, the kind that would have gutted any founding power cruiser, and a young gunnery officer aboard that hull, a Sethric named Ale Ryu who had not wanted to fire and had fired anyway because that is what a junior officer does, watched the solution land clean on Adamant's flank and do nothing at all, scour a little grime, polish a little metal. And then she watched the mountain, and she waited to die. She did not die. That was the thing Ale Ryu carried out of the seventh night and into the rest of her life. She fired on the deadliest ship in the history of the galaxy, from close range, without provocation, in violation of her own fleet's orders, and the ship did not so much as track a gun toward her. Adamant received the solution the way a mountain receives a thrown pebble. It noted it, in whatever way a thing that large notes anything, and it declined to respond, because responding would have meant killing a cruiser that had not yet been given its chance to strike its drives, and the humans did not kill things they had not first offered every chance to. The hail came across, low and even, Commodore Hale's voice, and it was not angry, and the absence of anger was the most frightening thing Ale Ryu ever heard. Sethric cruiser, that was a good solution, well laid. I want your gunnery officer to know that it would have killed most ships in your fleet. It didn't kill this one, and I'm not going to kill you for trying, because you haven't been given your chance yet, and I don't take a life before its chance. But I'd ask your captain to take his hull back into the formation, and think hard about the fact that he just fired his best shot into the thing your prime assessor called a bluff, and that the bluff didn't bother to look at him. When your chance comes on the 9th day, remember the 7th night. Remember that we let you keep the hull you fired on us with, and then strike your drives. The Sethric captain took his cruiser back into the formation, shaken, and on the 9th day, when the shooting started, he did not strike his drives, because pride is a deeper thing than one night's fright, and his hull died in the 3rd minute with all the others. But Ale Ryu lived. She had been at a gunnery station on the far side of the hull when the front of dust took it, thrown clear in a section that held atmosphere, one of the few Sethric who survived to be pulled from the wreck, and she lived because the ship she had fired on had, 4 minutes before, sent a medical party across to help pull survivors from hulls it had itself just killed. She lived in the end because of the mercy of the ship she had shot first. She spent the rest of her life unable to explain that to anyone who had not been there, and eventually she stopped trying, and only said, when the young asked her about the humans, the one thing that held all of it: I fired on them, and they let me keep my gun, and then they saved my life. Do not ever tell me what a thing is until you have seen what it does after it has already won. On the 9th day, the prime assessor came to the boundary aboard the flag hull Sovereign Ledger, and read the humans their violation, and it was the last order the High Ledger ever gave that the galaxy obeyed. Lorsch Vale heard it from the archivist's station on Sovereign Ledger, because the prime assessor had brought the hall's clerks to witness the reassertion of the arithmetic, and the newest clerk had been brought to log it, the way the newest clerk is always brought to log the things the old ones are certain will make them proud. She stood at her rail and watched Thel Osk, 200 years old, wrapped in the certainty of 40,000 years, address the single scarred mountain holding at the Coriol marker as if it were a freighter 3 grams over its charter. Unregistered vessel, the prime assessor said. You are in violation of the registered mass. You exceed the ceiling of the ledger. By the authority of the conquered and its 611,000 assembled hulls, you will strike your drives and submit to impound, or you will be reduced. You have refused this order once to a marshal who lacked the force to compel you. You do not refuse it to the convocation. There is not enough of you to refuse it to the convocation. His dry old voice did not flicker. Lorsch gave him that, to the end he never flickered. One hull does not defeat 600,000. It is arithmetically impossible. Strike your drives." And Commodore Hale's voice came back across the dark, low and even and tired, the same voice Coriol had logged, the same voice that had passed the soul jar, and Lorsch Vale entered it into the record with a hand that would not stay steady. "Prime Assessor, I have your order and I'm going to decline it, and this is the last time I'm going to explain why, so I'd ask your young ones to listen, because they're the ones who'll have to carry it." A pause. "You keep saying it's arithmetically impossible, and you're right. One hull defeating 600,000 is arithmetically impossible if both hulls are the same kind of thing. Your whole ledger is built on that if. You assumed for 40,000 years that every ship in the galaxy is the same kind of thing, differing only in how much of it there is, so that power is just mass and mass is just a number and the biggest number wins. It's a good assumption. It held for 40,000 years. It's holding right now for 610,999 of your hulls." The voice paused again, and when it came back there was something under the tiredness, something very old and very cold and very patient, the thing that had been resting at the marker with the stillness of a mountain. "It doesn't hold for the 611,000th, because adamant is not the same kind of thing. And you're about to find out in front of every watching species in this galaxy exactly what the other kind of thing is. I'm sorry, Prime Assessor. I gave you 60 years of couriers so this day wouldn't come. You convened it anyway, so watch closely. I'm only going to teach this once." The convocation fired, and it was the largest single act of violence in the recorded history of the galaxy, and it did not matter. Orduvane, in Recompense's forward battery, was 1/611,000th of it, and even so his gun's discharge slammed through his hull like a struck bell. The full convocation solution was not a lattice the way the tithe fleets had been. It was too large for a lattice, too vast to converge on a single volume, so the founding power gunnery masters had done the next thing, the overwhelming thing, and simply pointed 600,000 hulls at the mountain and told them to fire until told to stop. For a moment the dark around the Coriol boundary was not dark. It was a sun. It was a wall of directed fire so bright and so total that the watching species light towers away recorded it as a stellar event, a new star kindling at the edge of conquered space, and Orduvane in his turret felt the animal part of him sing, because nothing survives this. The arithmetic is the arithmetic, and the arithmetic just became a sun. The fire went on for 9 seconds. Then the gunnery masters, one by one, ceased, not on order but on instinct, the way a room falls silent when it understands that the thing it is shouting at has not been listening. The false sun guttered and died, and on Recompense's forward repeater in the cooling afterglow, the mountain was still there. Orduvane stared at it. He would stare at it for the rest of his life. The battleship Adamant hung at the Coriol marker exactly where it had hung, unmoved, unbroken, and across its scarred flank, the fire of 600,000 hulls had done what the tithe fleet's fire had done, only more so. It had scoured the ancient grime and scorch from great sweeps of the hull, and left the alloy beneath it brighter and cleaner and entirely unmarked, so that the ship now wore long gleaming streaks down its 3 kilometers like the marks of a cloth drawn across a table. And the streaks were beautiful, and they were the most horrifying thing Orduvane had ever seen, because they meant the galaxy had just thrown a sun at this hull, and the only effect had been to polish it. "It didn't move," Ordu said to no one, to his gun crew, to the dark. We threw everything. We threw a star and it didn't move, it didn't." Then Adamant fired, and Orduvane learned the difference between his kind of thing and the other kind of thing. It fired once. One gun of the 900 along its spine and flanks. Lorsch Vale would confirm the count later, from the human's own courteous disclosure, 900 primary weapons, and Adamant fired one of them. And it did not fire at the convocation. That was the lesson, and Ordu understood the lesson in the instant it was taught, the way you understand a thing that reorders your soul. the human ship did not fire at the 600,000 hulls arrayed against it. It fired past them, out and away, at the dead gray moon that hung a full light second beyond the Convocation's rearmost shell, a moon 2,000 kilometers across, a moon that had orbited the Coriol boundary since before the Conquered existed, a moon that was not a target and posed no threat and mattered to nothing. The moon came apart. Not shattered, came apart, the way the Vantari cruisers had come apart, reduced below the scale at which a thing has pieces, 2,000 kilometers of ancient rock unmade in the time it takes a heart to close, so that where a moon had hung there was now a swelling shell of cooling dust, and a light that outshone the false sun the whole Convocation had just kindled. One gun, one of 900. On a target a light second past the fleet, chosen precisely because it was a light second past the fleet, chosen so that no one could mistake the message, and the message was written across the sky in the ruin of a world. I am not firing at you. Understand that I am choosing not to fire at you. Look at what one of my 900 does to a moon 2,000 kilometers across, at a range past your whole formation, and then do the arithmetic you are so proud of, and understand that I have been able to do this to you from the moment I crossed your marker, and that I have not, and that the not is a courtesy, and that the courtesy is running out. Ordu Vane, 30 standard, gun captain of a founding power hull, 9th generation of a family that had crewed the tithe, sat in his turret in the light of a murdered moon and began, quietly, to weep. And he was not ashamed, because every gun captain in the Convocation who could see the repeater was doing the same. Prime Assessor, Commodore Hale's voice into the silence after the moon. That was the last courtesy. I want to be very clear that it was a courtesy and that it's the last one. I fired away from your fleet on purpose at a dead rock so that you'd have one more chance to strike your drives while everyone you brought is still alive. Take it. I am asking you to take it. Strike your drives and I will hold my fire. And this ends with a murdered moon, and a story your young ones tell their young ones, instead of the other thing. Lorsh Vale, at the archivist's rail on Sovereign Ledger, watched Thel Osk, 200 years old, receive his last chance, and she watched the thing that 40,000 years of unbroken authority does to a mind when reality finally comes for it, and it was the most frightening thing she saw that day, more than the moon, more than what came after, because the Prime Assessor did not break. A lesser being would have broken, and in breaking would have struck his drives and saved 600,000 hulls. Thel Osk did not break, because he could not break, because there was no version of Thel Osk that survived the breaking. He was the ledger. He had been the ledger for 200 years, and a being who is a ledger cannot admit the ledger has a missing page and remain himself. So he did the only thing his nature allowed. He reached for the arithmetic one more time, and he found it, and he clung to it, and Lorsh Vale heard the most powerful being in the galaxy answer a murdered moon with a syllogism. One gun, the Prime Assessor said. His dry voice did not flicker, to the very end it did not flicker. It fired one gun and destroyed a moon and did not fire on the fleet. You call it courtesy. I call it incapacity. If it could reduce the Convocation it would have. It fired on a moon because a moon cannot fire back, and it did not fire on us because it cannot survive our reply if it does. It is bluffing with a single heavy gun and a frightening light show, and it is asking us to surrender to a bluff. I have governed the ledger for 200 years. I do not surrender to bluffs. He raised his old voice to the whole Convocation, 611,000 hulls, the migration of war. All charters, all powers, full and continuous fire. Close the range, overwhelm it. The arithmetic is the arithmetic, press it and it holds. Lorsh Vale closed her eyes. She had read the human file. She had done the arithmetic the Prime Assessor would not do. She knew, in the moment the order left his mouth, that Thel Osk had just spent 600,000 hulls to protect the 200-year-old idea of himself, and that the humans had given him every possible chance to spend fewer, and that the record, her record, the newest clerk's record, would show forever that the number was his choice and not theirs. Log the time, she whispered to herself, to the cache no one knew she kept. Log the time it starts. It started, and Vesh, who had lived it once already, who had tried to tell them, who stood now on the flag bridge of Sovereign Ledger as a witness, no one had listened to, watched the humans stop being courteous, and understood that everything before this moment had been the courtesy. At Coriol, 4,000 hulls Adamant had swept. It attracted spine batteries across the Tithe fleet 2 degrees at a time, unhurried, killing in blocks of 40, giving the Marshal every one of the 160 seconds he took to find his surrender. That had been the ship being gentle. Vesh had not understood until now that it had been the ship being gentle. Now the courtesy was spent, and the convocation had closed to press the range, and 600,000 hulls were pouring continuous fire into a hull that polished under it. And Adamant answered at last with everything it was, and Vesh learned what the other kind of thing looked like when it stopped holding back. It did not sweep. Sweeping was for 4,000. Against 600,000, the battleship simply opened all 900 of its primary weapons at once, and it did not track them across the fleet in blocks. It did not need to. There was no volume of the convocation that was not a target. It fired all 900 continuously into the closing spheres, and where the fire went, the conquered stopped existing. Not ship by ship, shell by shell. The outer envelope of the convocation, the clients, the screening hulls, tens of thousands of them, ceased to be a formation and became an expanding front of cooling dust. And the front swept inward through the nested spheres at the speed of the human ship's tracking, which was the speed of a thought. And it ate the middle shells, the client powers, and it reached for the core, the founding powers, the pride of 40,000 years, and it did not slow. Because nothing in the arithmetic of the ledger had ever included a term for how fast the other kind of thing could kill. Time, Lorsch Vale said aloud on the flag bridge, because she could not stop being an archivist even now, because keeping the record was the only thing between her and the dark. 1 minute. The outer envelope is gone, all of it. 60,000 hulls in the first minute. Her voice did not break. She would be proud of that later in the long years she spent as the keeper of the true account. Her voice did not break. 2 minutes. The client shells are collapsing inward. They're not dying in blocks, they're dying in shells, whole shells at once. Vesh watched Orduvain's ship die in the 3rd minute. She did not know it was his ship. She would never know. But she watched the founding power core take the front of cooling dust, watched the proud Vantary cruisers, recompense among them. The 9th-generation hulls, the pride of the ledger, ceased to be ships between one instant and the next. And somewhere in that shell, a young gun captain who had laughed at her in a wardroom 8 nights before died in the light of the murdered moon with her face clearer in his mind than his own. And Vesh felt nothing, because she had used up all her feeling at Coriol. And all that was left in her was the terrible flat clarity of a witness, and the witness thought. He called it a bluff. He was 30 years old and he had a gun and a family and a ledger, and the ledger told him it was a bluff. And now he is dust in the light of a moon, and the ship that killed him is sorry, and the sorrow will not bring back 1 gram of him, and this is what the missing page costs. The envoy of the Autral watched the whole of it from the witness gallery, and she was the youngest person in that gallery, and she was the one the conquered had least expected to matter, and she was the one who mattered most. Her name was Sci-Fi, and she was barely of age by her own people's reckoning, a probationary envoy of a small, careful species that had come to the Selvage that season hoping to be admitted to the ledger the way Earth was being admitted, hoping for the protection of the balances, hoping to step across the boundary into the safety of 40,000 years of law. The prime assessor had wanted the probationary envoys in the gallery. He had wanted the small ones to see the ledger reassert itself. It was good for the ledger, he had said, when the small ones saw what happened to those who forgot their class. So Sci-Fi sat in the witness gallery of a founding power monitor at the edge of the convocation and watched, as the prime assessor intended, the true nature of power reveal itself. He simply did not understand which power he was about to reveal. She watched the fall sun kindle and die and leave the mountain polished. She watched the moon come apart a light second past the fleet. She watched the 4 minutes, the shells collapsing inward, the founding core taking the front of dust, and she did the thing that the young do when they are shown a truth too large for the story they were raised on. She threw away the story. Her people had come to be protected by the ledger. In 4 minutes, she understood that the ledger had never protected anyone, that it had been a courtesy the strong extended and a fear the strong maintained, and that the actual protection in the galaxy, the only real protection there had ever been, was the decision of a scarred mountain to hold its fire, and that her small, careful people had been about to entrust their whole future to a thing that turned out to be a habit 600,000 hulls thick and 1 afternoon deep. "They told us this was the safe side of the boundary," she said, to no one, to the officer beside her in the gallery, a vantary twice her age who was weeping and did not answer. "They told us the dangerous thing stayed on the far side in the dark, and the ledger held them there. And the ledger is dying in front of me in 4 minutes, and the thing killing it came in through the front door with a filed transponder, and the dangerous things were never on the far side at all. We were on the far side. We were the ones who didn't know what was in the dark." She watched the murdered moon's light on the collapsing shells. "I came here to be admitted to the safe side. There is no safe side. There was never a safe side. There is only the day you find out which kind of thing is standing at your marker, and whether it filed the forms." Sci-Fi went home to the Atral and told her people what she had seen, and her account was one of the 40 that remade the conquered. And 30 years later, she was the one who wrote her people's new founding principle. The one small, careful species after another would copy in the long reordering. "Trust nothing that governs by certainty, and honor the thing that governs by restraint, and remember that the ledger did not save you. The humans did, and they did it by choosing to, and a choice is not a law, and you must earn a choice every day that a law would have owed you for free." In the 4th minute, the selvage lit up, and the conquered learned that adamant had come alone as a courtesy too. Lorsch Vale caught it first, because the archivist station repeated the boundary arrays, and the boundary arrays were screaming. Out past the Coriol marker, out on the far edge of the selvage, where the humans' approach corridor crossed from the unregistered dark into conquered space, the long-range returns had begun to resolve. Not one contact this time, not one overflow, but many, coming out of the deep dark in a line, and each one of them painted the array the same way adamant had painted it 9 days ago at Coriol. Too bright, too clean, unregisterable, a mass with no class. Lorsch counted them as they resolved, her stylus moving on its own, the newest clerk doing the only thing she knew how to do while the galaxy ended. She counted 40. 40 more. 40 more scarred mountains, 40 more line battleships of Earth's 9th line, holding at the selvage in a long, patient row, engines banked, guns cold, doing nothing, watching. They had been there the whole time. Lorsch understood it in the moment she counted them. They had crossed with adamant or behind it, and held at the boundary in the deep dark where the conquered's arrays did not reach. And they had waited 9 days while one of their number sat at the Coriol marker and passed the soil jar and gave the assessorate every chance to strike its drives. And they had not moved, and they had not fired, and they were not going to, because they did not need to, because one had been enough, and the 40 were not there to fight. The 40 were there to watch. They were there so that when it was over, 40 human battleships could carry the account home to Earth and say, "We sent one, and one was enough, and here is the record of what one did, and here is the number that was their choice and not ours." The 40 were witnesses, the way Lorsch was a witness, the way the watching species lie towers away were witnesses. Earth had brought its own archivists, and its archivists had 900 guns apiece, and they had not fired one of them because the whole point, the entire terrible point, was that they had not needed to. "Prime Assessor," Lorsch's voice cracked the discipline of the flag bridge. She was the newest clerk and she was not permitted to speak, and she spoke anyway because someone had to say the number aloud. Prime Assessor, there are 40 more. At the selvage. 40 more of them holding cold. They Prime Assessor, they brought 41 and they only used one, and the other 40 haven't so much as warmed a gun. Silence the clerk, Thel Osk said. No one silenced her. That was the moment the flag bridge of Sovereign Ledger stopped belonging to the Prime Assessor, though he did not yet know it. No one silenced the clerk, because everyone on the bridge had heard her, and everyone on the bridge had seen the 40 resolve on the arrays, and everyone on the bridge was doing, at last, the arithmetic the Prime Assessor would not do. 41 battleships, one engaged, the convocation collapsing shell by shell in the 4th minute, and 40 more holding cold at the boundary as if the whole extinction of the Ledger's power were a thing not worth warming a gun for. Thel Osk made his last decision, and Vesh watched it, and it was the decision of a being who had rather end the galaxy than amend a page. Sovereign Ledger, the Prime Assessor said, and his dry old voice did not flicker even now, will lead the founding corps in a close pass. All heavy hulls form on the flag. We will close to contact range, and we will breach that hull if we have to breach it with our own keels. The arithmetic holds at contact. Its guns cannot kill what is already inside its armor. Form on the flag and close. It was madness, and it was also, Vesh realized with a kind of awe, the only move left on the board that the Ledger's logic could still generate. If range was the enemy, close the range. If the guns were the death, get inside the guns. Ram the mountain, board it, breach it. Prove that at contact range a founding fleet could still do what a founding fleet did. It was the last card in a game the humans had already won, and Thel Osk played it because the alternative was to set the cards down and admit the game had been the wrong game all along. The founding corps turned to form on the flag, and Vesh, rating, survivor, witness, 20-something standard and older in the eyes than anyone on the bridge, did the thing that ended the battle, and she did it not from courage but from the flat clarity of someone who has already watched this once and cannot watch it twice. She walked to the flag bridge's command channel, past the officers who outranked her and did not stop her because they were frozen, and she opened it to the whole convocation, every hull that could still hear, and she said, in a voice that did not shake because there was nothing left in her to shake, "This is rating Vesh, Immaculate Weight, Coriol Survivor. Do not form on the flag. Do not close the range. I was at Coriol. I have seen this ship let a fleet surrender." It stopped the instant the marshal struck his drives mid-sweep because it never wanted the number to be large. It does not want your number to be large. The humans have said 3 times in front of all of us that if we strike our drives they will hold their fire. I believe them. I have seen them do it. Strike your drives. Do not form on the flag. Strike your drives and live, or form on the flag and be dust like the shells before you. I am striking mine. This is Vesh. The Ledger was wrong. Strike your drives. And the founding corps, the pride of 40,000 years, 600,000 hulls reduced in 4 minutes to a guttering remnant, did not form on the flag. They struck their drives. They struck their drives all at once, shell after surviving shell, the great hulls going dark and cold and still across the ruined sky, the convocation surrendering not to the Prime Assessor's order but against it, on the word of a rating no one had ever heard of, because she had been to Coriol and they had not, and she had told them the one thing the Prime Assessor could not. That surrender was survivable, that the humans meant what they said, that the door had been held open the entire time, and all anyone had to do was stop throwing ships through it. Thel Osk gave 3 more orders in the seconds after, and no hull obeyed them, and that was the end of his 200 years, not with a breach or a boarding, but with the silence of a fleet that had finally, 4 minutes and 1 murdered moon too late, decided to do the arithmetic. Adamant ceased fire between one shell and the next. It stopped exactly the way it had stopped at Coriol, instantly, mid-fire, the 900 guns going dark in the same fraction of a second. The surrender crossed the dark, and the cleanness of the stop said the same thing it had said at Coriol, the thing that was the whole and only point. It could have stopped at any moment. Every hull that had died in the last 4 minutes had died in the interval between a surrender that could have come and a surrender that did, and the length of that interval had been set by Thel Osk's 200-year-old pride and by nothing else, and the humans had simply been waiting, 900 guns firing, for the pride to run out or for someone braver than the prime assessor to end it. A rating named Vesh had ended it. The record would show that too. Lorsch Vale made certain the record would show that, in the years she spent as its keeper, that the convocation was not stopped by the prime assessor of the conquered, but by the youngest voice on his flag bridge, who had been to the frontier and come back knowing the one thing 200 years of authority could not learn. The tally, when Lorsch Vale finished it, was the number the conquered would carry for the rest of its existence, and she made herself enter it clean, because a number that large deserved to be entered clean. Of 611,000 hulls convened at the Coriol boundary, 109,000 had struck their drives in time. 502,000 had not. They had died in the 4 minutes and 11 seconds between the prime assessor's order to press the range and rating Vesh's order to strike drives, and every one of them had died inside a window the humans had held open and begged them to walk through, and the width of that window had been the exact width of one old being's refusal to amend one page. Lorsch entered the number, and then she entered, beside it, in the assessor's judgment field, the sentence she had composed while she watched and would never take back. The 502,000 were not killed by the human ship. They were spent by the ledger, to protect the ledger, against the ship that had come to tell the ledger it was wrong. Then Commodore Hale spoke to the survivors, and it was the last thing Adamant did before it became a story, and Lorsch logged it as she had logged everything, and it went out of her log into the conquered, and out of the conquered into the long renumbering of history. "Conquered fleet," Hale said. Her voice was the same low, even voice, and it was tired all the way through now, tired in a way that Lorsch understood was not exhaustion but grief, the grief of someone who has done a thing they did not want to do and cannot undo. "You've struck your drives and we've held our fire. That holds. No one else dies today. I want your young ones to hear that from me directly, because your prime assessor spent 4 minutes telling them it was a bluff, and I don't want the last thing they learned from an authority to be a lie. It was never a bluff. We never wanted the number. We came here to be admitted to your ledger, and we filed a courier, and we brought adamant behind it so that when you saw us you'd see us true, and we gave you 60 years of the smallest face we had, and 9 days at your marker, and a murdered moon, and 3 chances to strike your drives, because at every step we would rather have had the smaller number." A pause. "Your prime assessor called our restraint incapacity. I want to answer that now, for the record, because there are 40 of my sisters at your selvage who came to carry this account home, and I want the account to be true. It was not incapacity. Adamant fired one of 900 guns at a moon. If we had wanted the conquered ended, I would not have needed the moon, or the 9 days, or the couriers. I would have needed an afternoon. We are not telling you that to frighten you. We are telling you that so you understand the shape of what just chose to let you live, and so that when you go home and amend your ledger, you amend it knowing that the amendment is a gift, and who gave it." The surrendered fleet was silent. 109,000 hulls, dark and cold, in the light of a moon they had watched die. And Lorsch Vale, at her rail, wept without shame and kept logging, because the log was the only offering she had to make to the 502,000, and she was going to make it clean. The stand-down took 2 days, and a young flag lieutenant named Cor Vante oversaw it from the Vantery side. And what he learned in those 2 days he could not have learned in a battle, because a battle teaches you what a species can destroy, and the stand-down taught him what a species chooses to do when it has already won. He had expected boarding parties. That was what the ledger's logic prepared him for, that a victorious fleet impounds the defeated, strips its charters, takes its officers, makes the surrender concrete in the old way, hull by hull. He had prepared himself to be taken. Instead, the humans sent across small, unarmed parties in the same 40-meter couriers, a handful of officers to each surrendered flag hull, and they did not strip anything, and they did not take anyone, and they moved through the dark, cold corridors of the founding power hulls with a quiet courtesy that unnerved Corvante more than any cruelty could have. They asked after the wounded. They offered their own medical stores, which were better than the Concord's, and did not comment on the fact that they were better. They helped restart failed life support on hulls the fire had crippled. They did the work of neighbors on the ships of a fleet that had, 4 minutes before, been pouring continuous fire into them. Why? Corvante finally asked one of them, a human medical officer who had spent 6 hours aboard his crippled monitor restarting scrubbers she had no obligation to touch. You won. You could take our charters. You could take the flag hulls, the founding corps' 2,000 years of Vantary shipwriting. Your ledger class is unregistered. You could write yourselves any prize you liked. Why are you fixing our air? The human straightened from the scrubber she had just brought back online, and she looked at him with the same tired plainness Corvante would come to recognize as the whole of the human manner. And she gave him the answer that he carried for the rest of his career and taught to every officer who served under him. Because we didn't come here to win, she said. Winning was never in question. You know that now. Everyone knows that now. It was never the point. We came here to be your neighbors. Lieutenant and neighbors is a longer arrangement than winning. You can win an afternoon. You have to live next to a neighbor for 10,000 years. And if the first thing we did after the shooting stopped was strip your hulls and take your officers, then for 10,000 years you tell your young ones that the humans are the ones who took everything, and that story would be a wall between us forever. And walls are how the dark pasture selvage used to eat species one at a time, by making sure no one would help their neighbor when the patient thing finally came. She gathered her tools. So we're fixing your air. And when you go home, you'll tell your young ones that the humans killed 500,000 of us and then came aboard and restarted our scrubbers, and both halves of that will be true, and the second half is the one that keeps us alive next to each other. Your prime assessor spent the first half. We're here to make sure somebody spends the second. Corvante watched her go back to work on a hull she had no reason to save, and he understood, in the cold corridor of his crippled ship, that he had spent his whole life inside a ledger that had a field for winning and no field at all for this, and that the humans had crossed the boundary to teach the Concord the missing field, and that it had cost 500,000 hulls to open it, and that the humans were now, patiently, on their hands and knees in the wreckage, teaching it to him, one restarted scrubber at a time. At Coriol, Neu Castle finished the incident record she had begun 9 days before, and she finished it because Overwarden Marovic asked her to, and because there was no one else who had kept it from the first overflow to the last surrender, and because keeping it was the only thing that had held her together through the murder of the moon. She had not stopped. That was the thing the Overwarden said to her, quietly, when it was over, that in 30 years he had never seen anyone keep the record through a thing like that, and that she had kept it through the whole of it, the overflow and the Corvette flight and the 2 minutes and 40 seconds and the accession dinner, and the 9 days and the moon and the 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and that Coriol's record would be the Frontier's record, the true one. The one the Conquered would have to read against the Prime Assessor's ruin. Neu did not feel like she had done anything but fail to run. But she took the compliment, because Odd Toma was standing beside her when the Overwarden gave it, and Odd squeezed her shoulder, and that was worth more than the compliment. Odd had come home. That was the small mercy Neu allowed herself out of the whole enormous horror. The Corvette flight had come home, all 3 cutters, 40-meter nothings that the mountain had never had any reason to notice, and Odd Toma had flown 15,000 meters from a battleship that killed moons, and he had come home, and he would fly the boundary for another 30 years, and he would tell the story at the frontier stations the way Neu told it in the record, plainly. Because the plain telling was the only telling that did it justice. "They're finishing the accession," Odd said. He was looking at the plate, where the 40-meter human courier had crossed the harbor again, back to its berth, unhurried, as if nothing at all had happened, as if the sky beyond the marker were not full of 109,000 surrendered hulls and the dust of 502,000 more. "They came back to finish the accession, Neu. After all of it, they still want to be admitted to the ledger." "Of course they do," Neu said. She understood it now in a way she could not have understood it 9 days ago at the overflow field. That was always the point. They didn't come to end the Concord, Odd. They could have ended the Concord in an afternoon, she said so, and after the moon, I believe her. They came to join it. They filed a courier and brought a battleship because they wanted to cross our boundary as members, in daylight in the open, with everything true on the record. The whole thing, the moon, the 9 days, the couriers, the number, all of it was them trying to be admitted honestly to a ledger that couldn't bear to write down what they were." She looked at the little courier settling into its modest berth. "The Concord spent 502,000 hulls to avoid writing one line, and the humans still want in. They still pass the soldier. That's the part that's the part Odd. They killed a moon to be polite about it, and they still want to be admitted, and they'll be the most powerful members of the ledger by so many orders of magnitude that the word member stops meaning anything, and they know it, and they came in the front door anyway and filled out the forms. They finished the accession that evening, in the ceremonial hall, under the pale banners set 9 days before for a small and grateful species. Overwarden Marovic presided, because it was his station and his duty, and because someone had to, and Neu Castle kept the record, because it was hers to keep. The 11 humans sat again at the long table set for 11. The gifts were weighed again on the balances of woven brass, the folded cloth, the jar of soil, the book, and recorded again in the ledger. And Marovic spoke the words of admission that a boundary overwarden speaks, the words 40,000 years old, the words that welcome a new species across the selvage into the Concord of registered mass. He spoke them to Commodore Hale of Earth's 9th Line, whose ship had just unmade 502,000 hulls of the fleet. Those same words were meant to protect, and his voice held, and Neu was proud of him for it, the way she had been proud of Dole for his level voice and Vesh for hers and Lorsch for hers, the way the frontier was learning to be proud of the young, and the steady in a galaxy where the old and the certain had spent 500,000 ships to be wrong. "By the balances of the Concord," Marovic said, "and by the ledger of registered mass, I admit the species of Earth to the rolls of the civilized at the class its filing warrants." He stopped. Everyone in the hall knew what came next. It was the part of the ceremony where the assessor names the new member's class, the sealing of their license, the amount of power the ledger permits them. Marovic looked at Neu because she was the assessor and it was hers to name, and he could not do it for her. Neu Castle stood. She had been dreading this since the overflow field, 9 days and a lifetime ago, and now that it was here she found she was not afraid, because she had kept the record and the record had taught her the truth, and the truth was almost restful once you stopped fighting it. She looked at the 11 small humans, and at the plate above them where 109,000 surrendered hulls hung in the light of a dead moon, and she said the thing that would go into the ledger and stay there, the amendment the Concord had spent 500,000 ships to avoid, the new line in a book 40,000 years old. "The ledger has no class for Earth," she said. Her voice was calm and specific, the way an assessor's voice should be. "It has no ceiling high enough to be their license and no field wide enough to hold their mass. So the ledger will make a new class, and Earth will be its only entry, and the class will not have a number because a number would be a lie." She entered it as she spoke it, and the ledger, 40,000 years old, opened a field it had never had. "The class is unregistered. Its ceiling is none. Its members are admitted not by the power the Concord permits them, but by the power the Concord asks them to withhold." Earth is admitted to the class of unregistered, first and only member on the 9th day, in the light of the moon it killed to be gentle. She looked up at Commodore Hale. Welcome to the ledger, Commodore. We wrote you down true. It only cost us everything we thought we were. Thel Osk did not survive the account, and he did not survive it because Lorsch Vale's account was true. And a true account was the one weapon in the galaxy the Prime Assessor had never armored himself against. He was not executed. The Conquered did not execute. The Ledger had no field for it. He was, instead, unmade in the only way that could unmake a being who had been an institution for 200 years. The record was read. Lorsch Vale's log timestamped complete, kept clean from the first overflow at Coriol to the last surrendered drive at the boundary, cross-checked against Neu Castle's frontier record and against the courteous full disclosure the humans themselves provided. 900 guns, 41 hulls, 1 gun fired, 1 moon, 3 chances offered and refused, was read into the high ledger in the great chamber on Vantes Prime, and it was read by Lorsch Vale herself. Because the Prime Assessor's own clerks refused to read it, and the newest of them would not refuse. She stood at the rail where she had once handed up documents to be ignored, and she read the number aloud, 502,000, and she read the window it had died in, 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and she read whose refusal had set the width of that window. And when she was done, there was nothing left of Thel Osk's 200 years, but an old Vantary in a chair who had spent the most powerful fleet in history to protect an idea of himself. And the chamber saw it. And that was the end of him. He gave up his balances the next day. He did not speak again in council. He had governed 40,000 years of certainty, and he was undone in the end by a 24-year-old clerk who kept a clean record and would not agree to unsee. Marshal Assessor Dole was restored. It was Lorsch's account that restored him, and Vesch's testimony, because the same record that unmade the Prime Assessor's certainty vindicated the Marshal's surrender, showed that Dole, alone among the Conquered's commanders, had done the arithmetic in time, had seen the missing page, had struck his drives at the cost of his pride to save the hulls he could still save, and had said on the flag bridge of immaculate weight the truest words any assessor spoke that whole long season. The ledger was wrong, there was a page missing, and the humans are the page. He was old and he had lost, and he was the only commander the humans ever spoke of afterward with anything like respect, because he was the only one who had understood the thing they came to teach on the first day it was offered. He served 4 more years. He spent them, at his own request, at Coriol on the frontier, teaching young assessors to read the raw and not the pretty display, and to file the thing that frightens them, and to never, ever confuse the size of a number with the truth of it. But it was Vesch who carried the most, and Vesch who the humans finally answered, because Vesch was the one who asked the question that the whole Conquered was too proud to ask, and asked it to the only being who could answer it. She asked it of a human. Not Hale. Hale had taken the courier back to Adamant when the accession was done, but a younger human officer, a lieutenant named Ivo Set, who had come aboard the surrendered flag-hull Sovereign Ledger as part of the small human party that oversaw the fleet stand down, and who was, Vesch judged, close to her own age, or what passed for it among a species that lived a human span. He was quiet and he was courteous and he did not gloat. None of them gloated, and Vesch had come to understand that the absence of gloating was the most alien thing about them, more alien than the guns. "I have a question," Vesch told him, on the dark flag bridge, with the surrendered fleet cold around them and the murdered moon's dust still catching the light beyond the ports. "You don't have to answer it. But you're the first of you I've been close enough to ask, and I was at Coriol, and I've earned it." "You were at Coriol." Ivo Set looked at her with something she had not expected, something that took her a moment to name, and when she named it she almost could not bear it because it was respect. "You're Vesch. You're the one who told the fleet to strike its drives. Commodore Hale mentioned you by name in her report to Earth. She said you ended it 4 minutes sooner than it would have ended otherwise, and that 4 minutes was 100,000 hulls. He inclined his head, a human gesture she did not know but understood. Ask, you've earned it. Where were you? Vesh's voice was flat, the witness's voice the only one she had left. For 400 years, past our selvage. You built that ship 400 years ago, and then you showed us couriers for 4 centuries. Everyone in the Conquered will spend the rest of history asking what you were doing out there, past our boundary, while we wrote grateful and minor in your file. I want to be the one who knows first. Where were you? Ivo Set was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her plainly, the way the humans told everything, and Vesh understood, listening, that the plainness was the mercy, because a thing that large told any other way would have broken her. There's a dark past your selvage, he said. You call it unregistered space, the place your arrays don't reach, and you kept your dangerous things on the far side of the boundary and told yourselves the boundary held them there. It didn't hold them there. Something was already there. It had been there longer than your Conquered, longer than your ledger, and it was patient and it ate, not world species. It took its time. It moved between the stars past your reach, and it unmade whole peoples so slowly and so far out that you never logged a single one of them because they crossed into your arrays as silence, as a species that had once traded and then simply stopped, and you had a field for that. Cultural decline, you filed it. Contact lost, you have a field for everything. He said it without accusation. We met it 400 years ago on our own frontier, coming the other way, and we did the arithmetic your prime assessor wouldn't do. We looked at a thing with no ceiling, and we understood that you don't fight a thing with no ceiling by building to a class. You build to a question, not how much will the law allow. How much does it take to make sure this never happens again? And then you build that, however big the answer is, and you keep building it, and you do not stop, and you do not tell the neighbors, because the neighbors are still filing couriers under a ledger that thinks mass is a number. Vesh's throat membrane had closed, and the thing, the patient thing, in the dark past our selvage. It's gone, Ivo Set said. That's why we crossed. That's the whole reason for the timing, Vesh. You'll want that in your record, and your friend at Vantes Prime will want it, the clerk who keeps the true account. We didn't cross your boundary to conquer a ledger. We finished the war 400 years in the making, out past your reach, against the thing your arrays called silence. And when it was done, we had a line of ships built to question with no ceiling, and a galaxy full of neighbors who'd spent 400 years writing us down as minor. And we decided the honest thing, the only decent thing, was to come in the front door, file the forms, and let you see us true before you found out some worse way. He looked at the dust of the moon. We killed the thing that was eating you in the dark, Vesh. You never knew it was there. We never told you, because telling you would have meant telling you what we'd built to kill it, and you weren't ready. You spent 500,000 hulls proving you still weren't. But it's gone. That's the part your ledger should write largest. The most dangerous thing that ever shared this galaxy with you is dust, and you never logged its name. And the reason you get to keep being frightened of us instead of dead of it is that we were out there in the dark for 400 years doing the arithmetic you were too proud to do. The 40 left the selvage 3 days later, and a young signals rating on a surviving founding power hull watched them go. And what she saw she carried to her grave as the truest measure of the whole affair. They warmed their engines, 40 scarred mountains at the edge of the dark, banked coal glow coming up to a steady burn along 43-kilometer flanks, and they came about, unhurried, in the long patient order they had held for 9 days, and they went back across the boundary into the unregistered dark, the way they had come. They had not fired. In 9 days, through the murder of a moon and the collapse of 600,000 hulls and the end of 40,000 years of law, the 40 had not warmed a single gun. They had come to witness, and they had witnessed, and now they carried the account home to Earth, 40 archivists with 900 guns apiece, and the signals rating watched the last of them dwindle into the dark and understood that this was the thing the conquered would never recover from, not the 500,000 dead, not the ledger's fall, but the plain arithmetic of it. Humanity had sent 41 battleships to an accession, used one, and the other 40 had gone home cold, and no one in the galaxy would ever again be able to look at a human courier and not wonder how many mountains were holding cold in the dark behind it. That was the amendment the humans had really written into the ledger, not the new class, not the word unregistered, the wondering. For 40,000 years the conquered had governed by certainty. Mass is power, power is licensed, the biggest number wins, the ledger closes. And in 9 days a species that filed couriers had replaced every certainty with a single permanent doubt, and the doubt was this: you do not know what they held back, and you never will, and they prefer it that way. The conquered had been a ledger. Now it was a species holding its breath forever. At the edge of a dark it had never charted, and every time a human ship crossed the selvage squawking a courier's transponder, 40,000 years of assessors would look at the clean small number on the display and feel, in the body before the mind agreed, the mass that the number was politely declining to show. Neu Castle stayed at Coriol and the couriers came again, and that was the strangest mercy of all, that on the surface, nothing changed. The humans flew couriers to Coriol. They filed 42-meter vessels and arrived in 42-meter vessels, small and correct and grateful, and they passed through the reception station on their way into the conquered, with all the modest courtesy of a minor trading species. And if you had walked into the ceremonial hall on an ordinary day a year after the accession, you would have seen exactly what you would have seen a year before. A small human delegation, unarmed, bowing exactly as deep as protocol asked and not 1 degree deeper, laying gifts on the balances of woven brass. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. The couriers were the same couriers, and now everyone who weighed them on the balances knew what the couriers were the small face of, and the knowing was in every gesture of the ceremony, unspoken, permanent, the mass behind the number. Neu trained the young assessors who rotated through Coriol, and she trained them the way Dole had trained her in his 4 last years. Read the raw, not the pretty display. File the thing that frightens you, and never confuse the size of a number with the truth of it. And she told them, every one of them, the thing she had learned at the overflow field and never unlearn it, that the most dangerous vessel that would ever cross their boundary would not be the one that overflowed the mass field. It would be the one that fit the field perfectly, the clean small courier, 42 meters exactly to license, because that one was the choice, and the choice was the threat, and a species that can be exactly as small as your ledger needs it to be is a species that is choosing, every single day in daylight in the open, with everything true on the record, not to be large. She made them understand that. She thought it was the most important thing she knew. She had watched a moon die to teach it to her, and she was not going to let it be for nothing. Odd Toma flew the boundary for 30 more years and told the story plainly at frontier stations up and down the selvage, and the plain telling made it grow, the way true things grow when they are told plainly, until the corvette pilots of the whole frontier knew, without ever being taught it formally, the one rule that mattered. You do not challenge a human hull. You greet it. You log it. You keep the record clean. And you never, ever, let a young pilot forget that 15,000 meters is close enough to see the windows and far too close to matter, and that the only safety in the presence of the other kind of thing is to be a 40-meter nothing it has no reason to notice, and to be grateful, every day of a long career, that it has no reason to notice you. Lorsch Vale became the keeper of the account, and she kept it for the rest of her life, and she made it the thing the conquered could not lie its way out of, because a species that had governed by certainty for 40,000 years would try, she knew, to soften the account with time, to file the whole catastrophe under a gentler field. A misunderstanding, a tragedy of communication, a regrettable escalation on both sides. Lorsch Vale did not permit it. She was young, and she rose because the account rose with her, And by the time she was old, she was the prime archivist of the conquered, and the single most important thing she did in that long office was to read the true account into the ledger, once a year, on the 9th day. In the light of the season the moon had died, so that no assessor who came after her could ever again confuse the size of a number with the truth of it. She read it plain. 611,000 hulls convened. 109,000 struck their drives in time. 502,000 did not, and died in a window 4 minutes and 11 seconds wide, a window the humans held open and begged the conquered to walk through, whose width was set by one old being's refusal to amend one page. 41 human battleships came to the boundary. One fired. It fired 9 of its 900 guns across the whole of the engagement. Lorsch had the count from the humans' own courteous disclosure, and she read it every year, because it was the number that mattered most. 9 guns of 900 on one ship of 41. And with 9 guns of one ship, the human species had ended 40,000 years of law and rewritten the ledger of the civilized, and killed a moon 2,000 kilometers across as a courtesy, and had then filed the forms and asked, gravely, to be admitted, and had gone on flying couriers. 9 guns. That was the line Lorsch Vale read loudest every year until she was too old to read. 9 guns of 900 on one hull of 41. She read it loudest because it was the whole of the lesson folded into a single ratio, the ratio the prime assessor had refused to see, the ratio that was the missing page, that the conquered had never been fighting a bigger number. It had been fighting a different kind of thing, a thing that did not build to a ceiling, and against that kind of thing the arithmetic of mass was not merely wrong, it was a category error. The same category error a young assessor named Castle had logged at Coriol on the first morning, when the ledger asked for a class and the ledger had none. The humans had never been unregisterable because they were too big. They were unregisterable because they were not the same kind of thing the ledger was built to weigh, and a ledger cannot weigh what it is not the same kind of thing as, and that, not the mass, not the guns, not the moon. That was what had crossed the selvage on the 9th day and taken its seat at the table set for 11. Adamant left Coriol on the 12th day, and Neu Castle and Odd Toma watched it go from the reception hall window, and neither of them spoke until it was gone, because there was nothing to say in the presence of a thing that large deciding to leave. It did not leave the way it had come. It had arrived decelerating out of the dark, a moon slowing down, filling the arrays until they tried to file it as terrain. It left the way a mountain would leave if a mountain could. Slowly, with an enormous unhurried dignity, the banked coal glow of its engine ports coming up to a steady burn along the whole 3 kilometers of its scarred flank, and then the flank began to move, and the moving of it was the thing Neu would remember, because a hull that size should not have been able to move like that, should have been ponderous, should have wallowed like the overweight freighters the Tithe fleet used to impound. Adamant did not wallow. It came about with the light, clean certainty of a cutter, 3 kilometers of battleship pivoting on its own length as if it weighed nothing, as if mass were a thing it carried by choice and could set down whenever it liked, and Neu understood, watching it turn, that this too had been a lie the ledger told itself, that heavy things are slow, that mass is a target, that a mountain cannot dance. This mountain danced. It had been able to dance the whole time. It had simply chosen for 9 days at the marker to be still. And as it came about, the light caught the long gleaming streaks down its hull, the places where the fire of 600,000 hulls had scoured 400 years of grime and scorch away, and left the alloy beneath it bright and clean and unmarked, and the streaks ran the length of the ship like the marks of a cloth drawn across a table, and Neu thought. The galaxy threw everything it had at this hull, and all it managed to do was clean it. All 40,000 years of the ledger's power converged, and the only mark it left was to polish the places it struck. She would try, for the rest of her life, to make people understand what that had done to her, the sight of those bright streaks, and she never quite could, because you had to have stood at the overflow field on the first morning and kept the record through all 9 days to feel it in the body the way she felt it. That they had polished the mountain, and the mountain had let them, and then the mountain had danced away into the dark on its own unhurried time, and somewhere out there it was still running, still fed, because the humans did not scrap the good ones. "Where's it going?" Odd said, when it was gone, when the last of the coal glow had dwindled past the marker into the unregistered dark. "Home, I think," Neyu said, "or wherever the line keeps. It came to be admitted, and it's admitted. There's nothing left for it to do here." She was quiet a moment. "That's the part I keep coming back to, Odd. It didn't stay. A thing that could do what it did, it could have stayed. It could have sat at our marker forever and been the master of the whole Concord, and no one could have made it leave, and it left. It filed the forms and it left, because staying was never the point. Being admitted was the point. It wanted a seat at the table, and it took the seat, and then it went home and left us to live in a galaxy where we know the seat is theirs and they're not even sitting in it." She looked at the empty dark past the marker. "That's the most frightening thing about them in the end, not that they can take everything. That they can take everything, and what they want is a seat at the table and a jar of soil weighed on the balances, and to be written down true. We spent 500,000 hulls learning that the thing we should have feared was never their hunger. It was their patience. They're patient the way the dark past our selvage was patient, except the dark ate, and they file forms." The other species had watched, and the watching remade the Concord more thoroughly than any battle could have, because the Concord had always been held together not by the tithe fleet but by the belief in the tithe fleet, and the belief had died at Coriol in front of everyone. There had been 11 probationary species at the accession season, small people stepping toward the selvage as the humans once had, invited to witness the admission of Earth as a lesson in the good order of the ledger. The prime assessor's own idea, that the new signatories should see the Concord's power reassert itself against the overweight hull, that it was good for the ledger when the small ones saw what happened to the ones who forgot their class. They had seen. They had seen the tithe fleet die in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and the convocation die in 4 minutes and 11, and a moon die as a courtesy, and 40 battleships go home cold without warming a gun, and they had drawn from it the only lesson it was possible to draw. That the ledger was a courtesy the strong extended to the weak, and that the strongest thing in the galaxy extended it gently and filed couriers, and that a small species stepping across the selvage was safe not because the tithe fleet would protect it, but because the unregistered had decided, for reasons of their own, that gentleness was worth more to them than mastery. A young envoy of one of those 11 species, a small careful people called the Atral, who had come to the selvage hoping for the ledger's protection and found instead the ledger's end, went home and told her people what she had seen, and her account, and 40 others like it, did to the Concord what no war had ever done. The client species began to file differently. Not in rebellion. The humans had killed rebellion at Coriol along with everything else, because there was plainly no power to rebel against and no power that could protect a rebel. They filed in a new register entirely, a register the ledger had never had a field for, and the register was this. They filed as peoples who had seen the true shape of power, and who understood that it did not live in the tithe fleet or the high ledger or the balances of woven brass, but in a line of scarred mountains holding cold in a dark past every array, whose only expressed desire, after ending 40,000 years of law, had been a seat at the table and a jar of soil weighed true. The Concord offered humanity a founding seat, and Commodore Hale declined it, and the declining was the last lesson, the one that finished what the moon began. They offered it formally, a year after the accession, in the great chamber on Vantes Prime, with Lorsch Vale keeping the record. The Concord, 40,000 years old, offering the highest station it possessed, a founding charter, a seat among the powers that wrote the ledger, to the species whose one ship had unmade the fleet meant to enforce it. It was the only move the Concord had left that preserved any dignity. If you cannot govern the strongest thing in the galaxy, invite it to help you govern, and pretend the inviting is not a surrender. Lorsch watched the chamber make the offer, and she watched Hale, gray-templed, unhurried, the same low, even voice, consider it with real care, the way the humans considered everything, and then decline it gently, and the declining was the thing Lorsch read into the record with the most careful hand of her life. "We're grateful," Hale said, "and we mean that, but no, we won't take a founding seat. We'll take the seat we filed for, a member's seat at the class you assigned us, which is the class of unregistered, first and only entry, no ceiling, no number. We'll trade with you and we'll neighbor you, and if the dark pasture selvage ever grows something new, we'll go out and do the arithmetic again, because we're better at it than you are and we don't mind the work. But we won't help you govern, because the moment we sit among the powers that write your ledger stops being yours, and a ledger that isn't yours isn't worth the balances it's weighed on. You've governed yourselves for 40,000 years. Keep governing yourselves. We'll be the neighbors who file couriers and hold the dark. That's the arrangement we crossed your boundary to make, and it's the only one we'll take, and I'd ask you to write it down true. Humanity was offered the galaxy and asked instead for a seat at the table and the right to be left alone. Write that down, archivist. Write it down loudest of all. Because 1,000 years from now, when your young ones ask why they should trust the unregistered, that's the line that will answer them, and it had better be true." Lorsch Vale wrote it down true. She wrote it down loudest of all. 40 years on, at a boundary station called Maris on the far rim of the Concord, a young assessor named Tuvo Ran watched a mass reading overflow the field, and he did not panic, because by then the whole galaxy knew what an overflow meant. He was 22 standard, the youngest full assessor Maris had ever fielded, and he had grown up on the account, Lorsch Vale's account, read into the ledger every year on the 9th day, taught to every assessor before they were let near a live array. He knew the story the way children know the founding myths of their people, because it had become the founding myth of his people, of all the peoples of the Concord. The day the ledger learned it had a missing page, the day the couriers turned out to be the small face of the mountains, the day a moon died as a courtesy. So when the mass field on his console rolled into overflow one ordinary morning, and the amber fault he had only ever seen in training lit his panel, Tuvo Ran felt his heart go into his throat exactly as Neu Castle's had gone into hers 40 years before at Coriol. And then he did the thing 40 years of the account had taught him to do. He did not scramble the Corvette flight. He did not file an impound notice. He did not reach for the tithe fleet, which no longer existed as an enforcement arm, and had become instead a fleet of pilots who greeted and logged and kept the record clean, because that was the only use anyone had found for it in a galaxy where enforcement had died at Coriol. Tuvo Ran looked at the overflow, and he looked at the transponder squawking clean and correct on the human accession channel, and he opened the hail himself, and he said the words that Maris Station taught its assessors to say to an overflow, the words that were the whole of what 40 years had learned. "Human vessel, this is Maris Way Station. We have your mass and your transponder. Welcome to the Concord. Your berth is ready. We built it to your true dimensions, not your filed ones. Please advise your reception when you're ready to receive your delegation, and thank you for crossing in daylight." The human voice that answered was young and warm and a little surprised, and it thanked him, and it said that the courtesy was noted and would be carried home, and that the delegation would come across in something small and appropriate to his harbor, per protocol if that suited. And Tuvo Ran, 22 standard, sat at his console at the edge of everything and felt the mass behind the number, the polite declining of the true dimensions, the choice inside the courtesy, and he understood in the body, the way Neu had understood it, the way the whole galaxy now understood it, that he was not afraid because the human ship was large. He was afraid, in the small permanent way the whole Concord was now always afraid, because the human ship was choosing to be small, and the choosing was a gift, and a gift can be withdrawn. That was the galaxy the humans had made. Not a conquered one, not a ruled one. A grateful one, grateful in the true sense, the sense the ledger had once used so casually in a probationary file, grateful and minor, never once suspecting that it was writing its own future condition. The conquered was grateful now, permanently, in a way it had never been when it was the most powerful thing that had ever existed, because it had learned the exact size of the thing that had decided to let it keep governing itself. And gratitude is what a small thing feels toward a large thing that has chosen, for reasons of its own, to be gentle. Neu Castle lived to be old, and she saw the account become the founding myth, and near the end of her life she was asked, by a young assessor who had come all the way to Coriol to hear it from the last living keeper of the frontier record, what the single truest thing was that she had learned on the 9th day. She thought about it for a long time. She had learned a great many things. She had learned that mass is not power, and numbers are not power, and the biggest number does not win. She had learned that the most dangerous vessel is the one that fits the field perfectly. She had learned that a ledger cannot weigh what it is not the same kind of thing as, and that 40,000 years of certainty can die in 9 days when a different kind of thing finally files the forms. But the young assessor had not asked what she had learned about the humans. He had asked what she had learned, and there was a difference, and Neu Castle at the end of her life had come to understand the difference. That they were kind, she said finally. The young assessor blinked. It was not the answer he had traveled to hear. You want me to say something about power, everyone does. They come here and they want the old assessor to tell them something cold and final about the true nature of power, and I've said all of it 100 times. But you asked what I learned, and the truest thing I learned, the thing I couldn't have learned any other way than by keeping the record through all 9 days, is that they were kind. A species that could have ended us in an afternoon spent 60 years showing us couriers and 9 days at a marker and a murdered moon and 3 offered chances, all so that the number would be as small as they could make it, and then declined the galaxy and asked for a jar of soil weighed true. That's not power. I know power now. I watched 500,000 hulls become dust in the light of a moon. Power is easy. Power is just a big enough number. What they had wasn't power. It was the thing they did with the power which was almost nothing on purpose, at enormous cost to their own patience, out of a kindness so large and so cold and so certain that it looked from where we stood exactly like the end of the world. She looked at the young assessor, and she smiled, the way the old smile at the young when they are about to hand them something they will need decades to unwrap. Write that down. Write it down true. The most powerful thing that ever crossed our boundary was also the kindest, and it is very important that you never let anyone tell you those were 2 different facts about it. They were the same fact. That's the missing page, not the guns. The kindness with the guns behind it, choosing, every single day in daylight to be small. The ledger kept 1 entry in the class of unregistered, and beneath it, forever after, it kept a blank line, and the blank line was the thing the assessors of the conquered learned to fear more than the entry above it. It was Lorche Vale who ordered the blank line in her last years as prime archivist, and it was the most deliberate thing she ever did, more deliberate than reading the account, because the account was a record of what had happened and the blank line was a warning about what had not happened yet. She had the ledger open a second row beneath Earth's, in the class with no ceiling and no number, and she had it left empty, and she had it made permanent. And when the council asked her why she was reserving a line for a member that did not exist, she gave them the answer that went into the ledger beside the empty row and stayed there for the rest of the conquered's existence. Because Earth is the first entry in this class, she said. First. The ledger uses that word, and the ledger does not waste words, and I will not let it waste this one. First means there is room for a second. We do not know what else is out there past our selvedge, in the dark our arrays never charted, that builds to a question instead of a ceiling. We know of 1 such species because it was kind enough to come in the front door and file the forms. We do not know how many came to other people's boundaries and did not file forms, because those people are the silences in our archive, the ones we filed under cultural decline and contact lost. So the ledger will keep a blank line beneath earth forever, and every assessor who opens this class will see it, and the blank line will teach the one thing the account cannot: that we were saved by a courtesy, not a law, and that a second courtesy is not owed to us, and that somewhere out in the dark there may be a thing that will one day overflow a mass field at some frontier station, squawking no transponder at all, and cross our boundary without filing anything. And when it does, the assessor at that desk had better remember that the blank line was always there, waiting, and that the ledger reserved it on purpose, so that no one would ever again mistake 40,000 years of quiet for 40,000 years of safety. They kept the blank line. It is still there. It is the most read line in the ledger of the civilized, and it has no words on it at all, and that is why it is read. Vesh lived a long time, longer than a rating had any right to expect, and she never rose the way Lorsch rose, because she did not want to, because the thing she had done on the flag bridge of Sovereign Ledger had used up whatever it was in her that wanted to rise. She spent her life on the frontier instead, the way Dole had spent his last 4 years, teaching young ratings the thing she had learned at Coriol and confirmed at the convocation: that surrender is survivable, that the door is usually open longer than pride will admit, and that the bravest thing a young officer can do in the presence of the other kind of thing is to be the first voice to say the thing everyone already knows and no one senior enough will say. She was old when a young rating asked her, at some frontier station whose name does not matter, whether she was afraid of the humans, whether all of it, the whole long lesson, had left her afraid. And Vesh, who had been closer to the murder of the Tithe fleet than any living Vantari, who had stood on the bridge when the moon died and told 600,000 hulls to strike their drives, considered the question with the flat clarity that had never once left her since Coriol, and gave the young rating an answer that the rating carried up and down the selvage for the rest of a long career. "No," Vesh said. "I stopped being afraid of the humans the day I understood them, and the day I understood them was the day the moon died. I'm afraid of what they're afraid of. That's the thing you should learn from an old woman who was there, rating not to fear the mountains, but to fear the thing that made the humans build mountains. They didn't build adamant to frighten us. We weren't worth frightening. They told us so, gently, for 60 years. They built it in a dark past our reach, against a patient thing that ate species so slowly we filed the eating under contact lost. And they killed it, and they came in and filed the forms, and they left a line of mountains holding cold in that dark, fed, patient, ready, because they know something we spent 40,000 years too proud to learn, that the galaxy is not a ledger and it does not close, and there is always another kind of thing out past the last array. I am not afraid of the species that told me that. I am grateful to it. I am afraid of the dark it warned me about. And if you learn one thing from me, rating, learn the difference, because the whole conquered nearly died of confusing the two. Somewhere out past the selvage, in the dark the arrays never charted, adamant is still running. It is old now, older than it was, and it will be running when everyone who logged its arrival is dust, because the humans do not scrap the good ones. They keep them fed. It bears the streaks still, the long bright places where the galaxy threw everything it had and managed only to polish the hull, and every century or so it crosses some boundary squawking a courier's transponder, small and correct and grateful, and an assessor somewhere feels a mass field try to overflow behind a clean 4-digit number, and files the fear and greets it and logs it, and thanks it for crossing in daylight. It never stays. It never rules. It files the forms and it goes home to the line, to the dark, to the patient work of holding a boundary. No one in the conquered can see against a thing no one in the conquered can name, and it asks for nothing but a seat at the table it has already declined to sit in. The conquered governs itself. That was the arrangement, and the humans have kept it, more faithfully than the conquered ever kept its own ledger. 40,000 years of certainty are gone, and what replaced them is smaller and truer and colder. A galaxy that knows exactly how large the thing that spared it was, and knows it chose to be small, and knows the choosing can end. They built a berth at Coriol once for a 42-meter courier, and set a table for 11, and welcomed a small and grateful species into the ledger of the civilized. They got their small and grateful species. It came in a courier exactly as filed, and it filled out every form, and it weighed its jar of soil true on the balances of woven brass, and behind it, 3 kilometers of scarred and dancing mountain held still at the marker with 900 guns cold, choosing in daylight, for reasons of its own, not to be large. That is the whole of it. That is what the ledger learned, and what it wrote down true, and what it reads every 9th day in the light of the season. A moon died to be gentle, that they expected a small shuttle, and got exactly the small shuttle they expected, and that the small shuttle was the kindest face of the deadliest thing the galaxy had ever failed to imagine, and that the galaxy is still here to be afraid of it, which is the only mercy the humans ever asked to be remembered for, and the only one they ever gave.